Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Dylan and I'm from Seattle in Washington, where I grew up in a very stunning green leafy neighbourhood with lots of parks and sizable houses in the area, full of character, whimsical charm and aesthetic appeal. Some of them steeped in a rich, vibrant, colourful history, which, much like the mature trees in our neighbourhood, stood head and shoulders above all the modern, more contemporary homes that invariably lacked that finesse, mystery and intrigue of their older counterparts. I lived here with both my parents and my sister Jennifer in a more modern, mundane, bungalow-style home. I wish I could describe myself as the perfect role model of a son, but unfortunately I was one of those impudent, rambunctious whippersnappers that was notoriously famous for getting into all kinds of scrapes and bother, causing my parents a considerable amount of grievous despair and many a sleepless night. It didn't help that I lived next door to the less than agreeable Nigel King, who was a rebellious scallywag and as mischievous as I was, and together we engaged in doing the most outrageously inappropriate things, like the super brats we invariably were. Once we both deliberately set fire to our neighbour's yard shed and hid and watched when we saw the old man, Mr. Roxburgh, running out of the house, crying out in a horrified voice, "Good grief! What the heck?" We watched in amusement as the poor man frantically tried to eliminate the flames, oscillating his arms wildly with the garden hose, while his alarmed wife quickly called out for the fire brigade, who arrived on the scene with their sparkling red fire truck and huge hoses, where they successfully extinguished the flames. We would watch these awesome, lion-hearted men terminate the fire like unsung heroes, and I was in secret awe of them. "Looks like arson," said one of the firefighters. "I think someone deliberately set fire to your yard shed, Mr. Roxburgh." "But who?" said Mr. Roxburgh. "I don't have any enemies." "Well, it could be kids getting up to no end of mischief." Mr. Roxburgh sighed. "Well, then it's Dylan Scott and Nigel King. You mark my words, they're behind this spiteful, malicious stunt. I might have guessed. They're the most unruly, wayward pair at the best of times, but together they bring out the worst in each other, like putting a detonator to dynamite, if you know what I mean." Of course, Nigel and I denied profusely that we were involved or even responsible for this horseplay or practical joke. But the locals in our neighbourhood all eyed us warily, with a "we know what you did" type of looks written on their faces. It would seem we were unable to pull the wool over their judicious eyes, because somehow they sensed we were the guilty party in this tomfoolery, but we wisely admitted to nothing. I think I enjoyed the drama that Nigel and I provoked in our neighbourhood, especially when people's dismayed reactions were priceless to see, and caused us a great deal of personal amusement. Nigel and I were big on pranks, most especially scaring people half to death, like when Mrs. Abby Easton discovered a very large snake slithering around on the front seat of her car, and she screamed out in terror, her face growing a deathly white shade, and her eyes virtually bursting out of their sockets. It would seem her terrified reaction was simply priceless to watch, and Nigel and I literally ate from laughing so much. Then there was the time when my mother crushed a roach while slipping on her shoes and cried out in disgust as her feet popped the squishy insect covering her feet in a ghastly mushy goo. And when my sister opened the door and was drenched by the bucket of water she dismantled that was precariously balanced on its upper ledge, and she was less than amused to be soaked as she was dressed to the nines that evening. I remember on one occasion when the milkman was delivering milk to the locals in our area, Nigel and I got up at the crack of dawn and coloured all the milk in our Seattle neighbourhood bright pink and replaced all the caps so perfectly and precisely that you would never have guessed that they had been tampered with. I do remember the dairy got no end of phone calls from the aggrieved, rather unsettled, fretful residents in our neighbourhood, who were more than a little peevish and concerned that there was something very strange going on with the milk, as it was a rather horrific bright pink colour. Some people mistakenly thought that the dairy had botched up the order and delivered them strawberry-flavoured milk instead. "It's dreadful," said one of the disparaging residents called Abby Easton. "We can't even trust our dairy these days," she carped bitterly. "If our milk is turning pink, one can only imagine what kind of preservatives they're using in the stuff. I've a good mind to turn organic with the way things are going of late. We can't even trust our local suppliers these days. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, what on earth is this world coming to?" Nigel and I loved playing tricks on the fault-finding, scathing Abby Easton because she was one of those smug, conceited do-gooders and self-righteous people who was quick to point out other people's shortcomings and failings. It would seem she clearly didn't perceive that she had any of her own. Somehow she envisaged herself as an angel with a halo of light on her head. She was the kind of person that believed that everybody else was going to hell when they died, with herself the exception to that rule, of course. In biblical terms, she would probably have been described as a modern-day Pharisee, for she loved to be seen doing great charitable works in front of the local people, in public, of course, and, of course, honorary displays to maximise the praise and adoration she received for her generosity. Yet I've never encountered anyone in my life so judgmental, critical and reproving of others, and so quick to tear someone's character to shreds without a bye or leave. One day when my mother was having some friends over to tea for the local book club, I overheard Abby Easton garrulously nattering away about one of the locals in a very condescending tone of voice. She was referring to a woman called Ella Fitzgerald, who had taken her large poodle Wilbur to the pooch parlour to acquire a fancy puffed-up hairstyle that had made Wilbur the talk of the town. The creative, showy dog grooming done by Doris Pennington, a notable talent with exciting dog styles, invited much commentary, and Wilbur had become a showstopper or a walking work of canine art, if you like, and was admired by many. "Of course, we all know why Ella Fitzgerald is getting her poodle glammed up to the nines," sniped Abby, with an exaggerated look of disgruntled disapproval on her face. "I think she just loves all the attention she receives. I was watching her the other day, revelling in all the fuss people were paying her poodle. The woman was positively gloating. She looked so pumped up. I thought she was going to explode with pride, like a sausage bursting out of its skin. I mean, it's absolutely appalling. Why should she be dolling her dog up to be the centre of attention? You can see she's loving the pandemonium she's creating. And as for Wilbur, that dog of hers, he's as bad as she is. He seems to be thriving on the interest he's stirring up. It's almost as if he knows he's in the limelight and has somehow become a Seattle superstar. It's appalling the lengths some folks go to in order to be the centre of attention." "If I didn't know any better, Abby," my mother had piped, "I'd believe you were seriously jealous, as your large poodle has been rather overshadowed and made to appear quite plain and nondescript compared to Ella Fitzgerald's dog, and you're distinctly put out about it. I can see it in your eyes, a touch of the green-eyed monster." "Don't be ridiculous," Abby chided. "You'd never get me taking my Percy to the pooch parlour for that kind of outrageous over-the-top grooming. Percy just receives a plain cut and blow-dry from Doris Pennington, and that's all there is to it. I would never saunter around the place showing my dog off like that. It's positively insane. The woman has an ego on her the size of the Space Needle. If it gets any bigger, the whole thing will collapse." "I disagree," said my mother. "I think it's fun when people step out of a limb to be so different. It makes the world a much more exciting place." A few days later, when Abby dropped her dog off at the pooch parlour for its grooming, I phoned the parlour very successfully, impersonating Abby's husband, and informed the salon that I was desirous for my large poodle to look exactly like Wilbur. Ella Fitzgerald's poodle, but, of course, with the added touch of a bright pink rinse to her white coat. "Are you sure your wife will be happy about this?" asked Doris Pennington. "I've always considered Abby rather conservative, if you don't mind me saying so, and very safe with her doggy hairstyles, especially on Wilbur. I've never considered her the adventurous or artistic type." "Absolutely sure," I had insisted. I will never forget how everybody was whispering and giggling when Abby Easton walked her puffed-up bright pink poodle around the streets of Seattle, insisting that she had absolutely nothing to do with Percy's outrageous new hairstyle, and that Doris Pennington at the dog salon had got her wires crossed. Nobody believed a word of it. They were certain that Abby was trying to outshine Ella Fitzgerald's dog. I promise you, Abby Easton so enjoyed the attention that Percy was receiving from the Seattle residents that for as long as I can remember, she continued dyeing her poodle bright pink and giving Percy some very unique over-the-top hairstyles, and she went to extraordinary lengths to ensure that her poodle upstaged Ella Fitzgerald's dog Wilbur every single time. What was even funnier was when Ella and Abby were both paid to be on an advertisement on television to promote a special range of dog shampoos. It's incredible how Abby became the world's biggest hypocrite. Nigel and I rarely enjoyed causing chaos and disorder growing up, because it was infinitely more exciting for us than being well-behaved and disciplined boys that our parents longed for us to become. All my school reports would say Dylan could do a whole lot better if he applied himself. He is intent on getting up to all kinds of pranks in class and seems reluctant to concentrate. I believe your son has the potential to acquire top grades, but he refuses to make any kind of effort, and is lazy, obstinate, and very opinionated. So yes, Nigel and I did find ourselves getting embroiled in all kinds of trouble, and on one occasion I almost blew my hand off when the two of us made a petrol bomb, and my parents were appalled by my perilous antics that could have potentially cost me my life. When I was young, I always had the sense I was invincible, but when a couple of thrill-seeking dudes in our school lost their lives attempting a daredevil stunt, when they jumped naked into an icy cold river and ended up dying of hypothermia, I began to realise that maybe I was not quite so indestructible after all. My strange story that ultimately led to my Bigfoot encounter happened in 1993, when I was 18 years old at the time, and seemingly in love with a girl called Amanda Sanderson. The trouble is nobody liked her at all, most especially my parents, but I thought she was drop-dead gorgeous, as she was like a walking Barbie doll on the outside. But as far as her character was concerned, she was certainly lacking in the charm department, and had acquired for herself a growing army of enemies who simply despised her. But that was no skin off my nose. I didn't care what others thought about my girlfriend. Well, so I thought. I remember one evening when I retired to my bedroom, my father knocked on my bedroom door. "Can I come in, son?" he asked. "If you must," I said, secretly thinking to myself, what have I done now? My father sat awkwardly at the end of my bed, playing with his moustache ever so uncomfortably, as if he was trying to stall for time, as he meditated on what to say to me and how to handle an overreactive, very belligerent and tumultuous teenager whose moods were as changeable and as choppy as the weather. "Amanda is a very pretty girl," he said solemnly. "Yeah, and what?" I said in a sarcastic tone. "What are you getting at, Dad?" "Son," said my father, pausing for a moment, "your mother wants me to have this talk with you. We don't believe that Amanda is right for you." "Why do I care what you think about Amanda? She's my girlfriend, Dad. Get your butt out of my business, please. I don't care what you think. It's my life, and Amanda is my girlfriend, so bog off and keep your nose out of my business. My father raised his voice. Well, you should care what we think, son, because maybe your mother and I have a little more life experience behind us than you do. And if you listen to an older person, you may just receive some wise counsel that will serve you very well and be in your best interests. What's wrong with Amanda? I snapped. She's not a good person, son. Yes, looks good on the outside, with the fake eyelashes, the blonde hair, and very extensive breast augmentation going on, all that kind of thing. So I snapped, what's your point? I've heard from multiple sources that Amanda Sanderson is a very bad person. Do you know when she was a little girl, Percy Porter caught her trying to drown a whole bag of baby kittens in a lake? Luckily, he grabbed the kittens from her and managed to save their little lives. He told me he'll never forget the insidiously evil look on Amanda's face. He said she turned around and gave him a wicked grin, and for a second her pretty blue eyes went as black as coal. He said it was like he was looking at the devil himself. What stuff and nonsense, Dad, I piped. Amanda would never do something like that. It gets worse, said my father. I gather she once got an old boyfriend of hers to disable the brakes to her own father's car. Imagine that, simply because he refused to let her have plastic surgery to enhance her assets, and she was very furious. He continued, do you know her father was very lucky not to lose his life that day? He doesn't speak to Amanda anymore, as a result of the nefarious incident, and even he describes his own daughter as sick and mentally unstable. I have learnt that her own mother is afraid of her, which is why she gives Amanda everything she wants at the drop of a hat, because if she doesn't, Amanda has a tantrum and physically beats her up. Now, son, think about it. That's not normal behaviour. It would seem that she is a self-centred, spoiled, narcissistic personality type that will stop at nothing to get what she wants. Why, Dad, do you believe the lies people are telling you? They're probably just jealous because Amanda is so attractive. Is that what you really think, son? Has it not crossed your mind that people around here are looking out for your best interests because they care? You have no idea what that girl is capable of. We are exceedingly worried that you could end up in the firing line if you get on the wrong side of that girl. She could seriously hurt more than your heart, son. We're worried about you. We love you. It's our right and duty as parents to be concerned for your welfare. I put my hands over my ears. I've heard enough, Dad. Thanks, but no thanks. I'm sorry. I don't buy into all this crazy stuff. I'm old and ugly enough to make my own decisions. Now leave me alone and get out of my room. You might be old enough according to the law, son, but you're not emotionally mature yet, and you're exceedingly naive. Even your sister is disappointed in your choices of late and believes Amanda is a very bad influence on you. Get out, Dad, I snapped. I've heard enough. Thank you very much. Suffice to say, the more that my parents tried to persuade me to call things off with Amanda, the more angry, contrary and retaliatory I became, and the more inclined I was to pursue my relationship with her, even more vigorously than before, like a bull at a bullfight, getting more heated and enraged by being heckled by his antagonizer. I was bloody-minded and opinionated at the best of times, and would be damned if my parents were going to interfere in my life and tell me what to do. I was amazed when my best friend Nigel King had some less than favourable words to say about Amanda. You know we've been best friends, bro, for years, so I'm going to say it as it is. There's something about Amanda that's seriously off. Like what? I protested. Not you as well. My parents have only just given me a hard time about her. Well, I heard a rumour that Amanda was responsible for knocking down an old lady when joyriding out in her mother's car. Your girlfriend doesn't even have a driving licence. And there was a witness who came forward who swears that Amanda looked like she deliberately hit that woman. Oh, I heard about that, I said. It was a terrible accident, that's all. And the old lady was fine in the end, so what's the big deal? Tell yourself that as much as you like, bro, said Nigel, but it doesn't change a thing. I still think Amanda is a nutter, that's all. She's not right in the head. And the only thing Amanda cares about is Amanda, and stuff everybody else. I'm not going to pretend that I wasn't slightly troubled and perturbed by people's less than favourable opinions about Amanda, but I was crazy about her and completely infatuated. I'd never been out with such a wild card before. Amanda was flamboyant and completely over the top, and I think I was like a pathetic puppy dog as far as she was concerned, as I was beguiled, bedazzled and seemingly intoxicated by the exotic blonde bombshell. That was all about to change in ways I would have never envisaged possible. It all began when I was planning a trip to a forested area in Washington state for a camping weekend with Amanda, an idea that did not bode well with my very guarded parents. I could hear them discussing me behind their backs, and I eavesdropped in on their conversation. He's young and impressionable, piped my mother. He's completely obsessed and smitten by Amanda. There's nothing we can do about it. I think this camping weekend is not a bad idea, as Dylan might just wake up to find out exactly what Amanda is all about. There's nothing like a stark bit of reality to wake up a young man and help him to smell the coffee. I'm not sure you're right, said my father. Amanda appears to have her sharp claws embedded in our son like an eagle's talons. He's acting like a robot, almost eager to do her every bidding, as if she has him under some kind of a trance or spell or mind control, if you like. It worries me that she might set him up to get involved in something nefarious that he'll later regret. Sweetheart, I do get where you're coming from, but we can't spoon-feed our son, nor live his life for him. We can't stop him from making mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes, and he'll learn from them. I'm sure he'll be fine in the end. I was really peeved off to hear my parents talk about Amanda in such a disagreeable way, but a voice in my gut told me to pay attention to what my parents were saying. I didn't want to listen to that warning voice, as no teenage boy wants to admit that their parents might just be right on the money. Before long, Amanda and I were out on the open road, taking the 2.5-hour journey towards an area of national forest where we intended to go camping. Amanda was sitting in the front seat, blowing and popping bubblegum balloons in her mouth, and giggling for most of the journey, while we happily bopped around in the car to some of our favourite musical tracks, throwing our arms around the place as we swayed our upper torsos to the music and tapped our legs on the rubber footwear of the car. I was feeling very happy, until suddenly Amanda asked if she could drive. You haven't got your driving licence, I reminded her. You know you're not supposed to drive. Look what happened when you were joyriding in your mum's car. Big deal, she said. I've been driving since I was a little girl. I know how to drive. Come on, Dylan. Don't be such a wet blanket. All right, I said. But if you drive dangerously, I'll be back in the driver's seat like a shot. And that's a promise. It wasn't long before Amanda was driving down a dirt road when a dog ran out in front of the car. It would have been easy for Amanda to stop the car to allow the dog to cross the road, but instead she pressed down the accelerator and speeded up, and began to giggle as if it was a big joke. I could discern the ominous thud of something hitting the car, and I could feel the nausea rising up in the back of my throat. I wanted to be violently sick, as I knew Amanda had deliberately run over the dog. How could she do this despicable, deplorable thing? Nobody normal behaves like this. We stopped the car, and I shrieked at Amanda, "What the heck have you done? You could have stopped for the dog." Amanda parked the car on the side of the road, and I raced over to the poor whimpering dog. He was going to be all right, I said to Amanda. You just ran over the leg. We can take it to the vet. I began to stroke the beautiful Rhodesian ridgeback, reassuring it. It's all right, boy. I'll get you some help. The dog looked up at me with grateful eyes, seemingly comforted and reassured by my calming voice. Before I could think about the next course of action, Amanda had retrieved my revolver from the glove compartment of the car and placed the rifle on the dog's head, killing it at point-blank range. I was mortified and appalled. "What the heck did you do that for, Amanda?" I piped. "We could have saved this dog's life. I was about to take it to the vet. It would have made a full recovery. What on earth were you thinking?" "Oh, please," she said. "It's just a silly mutt." "Amanda, that could be someone's beloved dog," I piped. "Who cares?" she said. "We put him out of his misery." In that moment, the magical potion that had made me believe that Amanda was the most gorgeous woman that had ever graced the face of the earth just suddenly dissipated like the smoke from a chimney and blew away. Now her blonde hair and pretty blue eyes were contaminated by this vulgar ugliness, and in an instant I failed to find anything remotely attractive about her. To me it was as if the blinders had come off my eyes, and I realised that Amanda was a monster, and this unmasked woman sitting next to me was now quite possibly the most hideously grotesque, evil, repugnant and ugly woman that I'd ever seen in my entire life. "You know what, Amanda," I said. "Let's give this camping trip a miss. I think we should go back home. I don't feel good." "What the heck is wrong with you?" snapped Amanda. "You are now so embittered because of a pathetic dog. Are you really that lame? We're going camping, and that's final. I've been looking forward to this trip, and no one in this world is going to spoil it for me, not even you." I sat there in my car, persuading myself that I could manage a weekend with Amanda, but when I returned home, if I ever saw her again, it would be way too soon. "Oh, here we are," said Amanda, taking a swift turn down a rugged, precipitous road where my car was bumping precariously all over the place. I bit my lip tightly, as I wanted to protest at the atrocious way Amanda was driving my car, but I thought better of creating more discord between us, as things were already overheated. Finally we parked the car in a rather remote car park that was overgrown with weeds, creeping through the tarmac, and it looked so vacant and badly maintained, as if it hadn't been used in years. It must have taken about 3 hours of exhausting, solid, steep uphill walking as we trekked through the meadows of flowers, past a large silvery lake, and then began ambling through a vast wooded area that was so stunningly beautiful that I was completely transfixed. The trees were so old and mature, they towered up into the sky like imposing giants, with the grace of ballet dancers, and the shaded canopy that arched over our heads emitted a gentle light through the branches of the trees that dappled the floor in a subtle luminescence. I was completely bedazzled by this rich verdant oasis, where even the large voluptuous boulders and shapely tree trunks were swathed extravagantly in a sumptuous velvety green moss. There were lacy, delicate ferns and colourful wild spring flowers springing through the brush, brightening up the woods in splashes of pinks, violets and blues, like the bright colours on an artist's palette. This exquisite, peaceful sanctuary was alive with pretty bird song, and we even discerned squirrels and chipmunks scurrying up the trees, eyeing us ever so curiously as we made our presence known. Soon we found a shelter on the edge of the woods, on an extensive clearing on a high elevation that overlooked the bewitching valley below, where we could observe the large silvery lake, flanked by a huge imposing mountain and heavily fringed by alpine trees. Many campers had been here before us, but not for a long time, as even the fire pits appeared dismantled, as if they had not been used for a long while. "It's beautiful here," I said, taking out my binoculars and viewing the lake in the valley below. It gleamed in the noonday sun, reflecting the trees and the mountain on its shimmering silver surface, rather like a sparkling mirror. We hitched up our tent and prepared a fire pit, and it seemed as if time was accelerated speedily, much like the remote control of a television on fast forward. For soon the sun set over the valley, in a magnificent fold of gold and pink and tangerine, only to be eclipsed very dramatically by the prompt arrival of the dusky night, and the resplendent silvery displays of the glittering stars, along with a very bright luminescent moon. As we ate our spicy chicken kebabs, I asked Amanda why her relationship with her father was on tender hooks, and why they'd fallen out so badly. "My father told me that your boyfriend disabled your father's brakes in the car, because he'd refused to allow you to have plastic surgery." I watched as Amanda chewed her chicken kebab. "Yeah? So, big deal?" You mean you did get your ex-boyfriend to disable his brakes? I asked in horror. You could have killed him, Amanda, and this is your father we're talking about. Your very own flesh and blood. Have you seen my father? Piped Amanda. He's a real loser. He deserved everything he got. Even if that is true, Amanda, you do realise that if your father had died, you would have been culpable for murder. You're lucky your father never turned you in to the police. You could have got yourself into some serious trouble. Oh, please stop the melodramatics, Dylan. Change the record. I'm bored of this subject. That night I lay in my sleeping bag, with my eyes wide open. I was a complete and utter idiot. My parents were absolutely right. Amanda was a treacherously evil person. She was duplicitous, deceitful and guileful, and she was only interested in herself. Why had I been so beguiled and deceived by her attractive veneer? Was I so shallow that I'd allowed a woman to manipulate me like this, just on her alluring physical appearance, without being able to really discern the hideous state of her heart? Was I that immature, ignorant and naive? I wrestled with the images of Amanda in my mind, and fleeting memories came flashing back like the pictures on a video recorder, where I record times when she had shown her true colours to me. I had chosen to ignore the foul, brutal words that had emanated from her sharp tongue, that were cruel, toxic, unkind and mean, where she had demeaned and undermined people in my presence. I had turned a blind eye to it all. What on earth was I thinking? It was clear my head had been in the clouds, and I had failed to see what was in plain sight. I could hear Amanda's gentle snores, and then in a trice it would seem that I had sunk into the world of dreams myself, only to be awoken and disturbed by strange, anomalous noises outside our tent. I sat up in alarm. I could hear feet dislodging stones around the clearing, as something very sizable walked around our campsite, almost deliberately kicking up the stones. The footfall was thunderous and far heavier than that of a man, but it did sound bipedal. What could it be? Imagine my surprise when our whole tent wobbled precariously from one side to another, as if it was facing the wrath of a punneling wind. But there was no wind on this night. Someone was outside our tent, shaking it backwards and forwards like a boat on a tempestuous, turbulent and choppy sea. I could feel my heart thundering violently through my chest. What the heck was going on, I wondered. All of a sudden I heard what I can only describe as snorting sounds, rather reminding me of a horse when it breathes very deeply. Now I was certain we were dealing with a bear rampaging around our tent. I breathed a huge sigh of relief when I suddenly heard the heavy footfall walking away and leaving our campsite. I stealthily tried to wiggle out of my sleeping bag and manoeuvre myself out of the tent, but the critter, whatever it in God's name it was, appeared to be standing only yards away from me, and turned around, having obviously picked up the vibrations of my movement with its very sharp ears. I could see a pair of bright red eyes staring at me from 8 feet off the ground. Oh my God, I thought, what in God's name is that? For in the darkness the critter was the scariest, most terrifying thing that I have ever beheld in my life. The intimidating critter stood erect, proud and tall, like the trunk of a very large tree. It manoeuvred its shoulders and head to face me. For a while we stared at each other. It was almost as if the critter's eyes had a hypnotic hold on me, for I was drawn into them, like the milk being sucked up a straw. The creature appeared human, but it wasn't human in fullness, for there was ape-like influences to its anatomy. For a start, the pyramid head shape rather reminded me of the mountain gorillas of Rwanda that I'd so often seen in documentaries, along with the overlong arms and the powerful muscular definition so vividly pronounced in the critter's stocky build. Yet the body was shaped like a man, but in a giant-like interpretation, and the face was so human, but the dark shadows of the night obscured many of its features. I could also discern that the critter was covered in long flowing hair, that appeared of a dark colour, but what exact shade it was I'm not certain, for in my experience auburns and browns can sometimes appear almost black at night. As I was staring at the critter in awe, I do believe in those seconds that my fear had been hijacked by my complete shock at seeing something that appeared incongruous to our reality, for indeed the critter looked so out of place that I was mindful to believe I might actually be dreaming. I could sense the critter meant me no harm, as it suddenly turned around to glide back into the woods from whence it had come. Unbeknown to me, Amanda had spied the critter from the window of our tent, and ran out of our tent, firing shots after it to scare it away. But her reactions backfired on us both very gravely. All of a sudden the critter turned around and thundered towards our tent, like a maddened rhino in full charge, for Amanda had provoked the critter to rage. It was now furious, and its mouth curled back to reveal its oversized human teeth, and the critter made the most dreadful growl that caused the hair on the back of my neck to stand on end, and I could feel this ominous cold chill engulf my entire being. I now knew that I was living on borrowed time, because this critter was going to definitely kill us. The critter was only standing yards away from us, and circling us like a lion that is surveying its prey that it's about to pounce upon. All of a sudden, Amanda pushed me very hard towards the critter, so that I fell on the ground and was only yards away from him. I could have touched his ankles with my hands. Amanda then ran through the woods as fast as she could, determined to save her own skin, and offer me as a sacrifice to the critter. To my amazement, the critter left me alone, and ran directly after Amanda, and I could hear her shooting after it and screaming, and then the screaming subsided, and everything became airily silent, and then the critter thundered back through the woods, passing our camping site, and glancing at me briefly as it sped off out of sight. I was certain that Amanda was dead, but imagine my amazement when I found her on the ground, cursing and swearing. "What happened?" I asked. Amanda looked surprised to see me in one piece, as I think she believed that the critter had probably killed me. "What happened?" I repeated. "The critter grabbed the gun from me and threw it somewhere here in the brush. It then picked me up and looked me directly in the eyes. It looked right through me and growled. It then threw me in the air like a ball, but it caught me. I've never been so scared in all my life. I thought it was going to kill me, Dylan. But then it put me on the ground lightly and glided away. You do realise you caused all this chaos, Amanda? I think he was curious about us, that's all. He was leaving our campsite when you shot at him. What on earth were you thinking?" "I want to get out of here now," said Amanda. "I can't abide staying in the woods a moment longer, not with that monster around." To cut a long story short, you'll be glad to know that I promptly ended my relationship with Amanda, much to my parents' delight. I never ever heard from her for many long years, but I had heard idle gossip that she had spent a long stint in jail and was now completely estranged from her family. At this stage of my life, I was happily married to my beautiful wife Susanna and our 2 gorgeous children. One day I was at the food aisle at Walmart doing some shopping for my wife Susanna to find myself being poked by a very overlarge, rough, masculine-looking woman with excessively large biceps, lots of black tattoos, and several rings in her nose. "Hello, Dylan," she said. "Long time no see. It must have been years since we last saw each other." I felt very embarrassed because I didn't recognise this woman. Who on earth was she, I wondered. "Sorry," I said. "I don't mean to be rude, but do I know you?" The woman looked rather offended. "Dylan, it's me. Don't you remember? Amanda Sanderson. We were an item once. Surely you haven't forgotten." As you can imagine, I was stunned, because Amanda Sanderson had morphed from a Barbie doll into a sumo wrestler. How was that even possible? "It's been a long time," I agreed, "but of course I haven't forgotten you." "It's been too long," she said. "We've had some good times together, you and I. So what you been doing?" "Well, I'm very happily married, and I have 2 children." "Nice," she said. "Very nice." "What about you?" I asked. "What have you been doing?" "Well, I got robbing a bank with an ex-boyfriend of mine. Not a good influence, I have to say. Spent a stint in jail. Wasn't pretty. 9 years for my trouble, that's what I got. Then I did another stint in jail. Never learnt my lesson. Committed fraud with another boyfriend. So, in all, it has been a bit of a rough road. Oh dear, I said. Not good. Do you remember the critter we encountered on that camping trip, she asked me. How could I forget, I said. Well, I told all my jail buddies our story, but no one believed a word of it. They said I was making the whole thing up for attention. Well, it is an outlandish story, I agreed. Unless you were there, it is rather hard to believe. You do realise we saw a Bigfoot? Well, yes, I have gathered that, I said. At that, she promptly said goodbye. And then I discovered her arm in arm, walking down the aisle with another woman who looked even more masculine than she did. It looked like they were a couple. So if there is any moral to this story, my advice to you is if you are young and impressionable like I was, just remember if the book cover is exceedingly attractive, it doesn't necessarily mean the book is good at all. And even an attractive book can lose its gloss. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Sandra, and I'm initially from Texas, which is situated in the south-central segment of the country, where I grew up on a horse ranch with both my parents. But after I got married to my husband Jimmy, who works for the Forestry Commission, we moved to the fertile, rich soils of West Virginia in 1992, which is situated in the Appalachian Mountains, surrounded by acres and acres of dreamy forest. I enjoyed moving to West Virginia, although I adore the great state of Texas, where everything is definitely bigger. I was born and raised as a Texas cowgirl on my father's sizable cattle ranch, so Texas really does stay in my blood and becomes a part of you. But a change of scene never ever did anyone harm and is a tonic for the soul, and it certainly was for me. The hands of fate played an intrinsic part in acquiring our new home in West Virginia in a way we could never have imagined. At the time, we were renting an attractive house in Charleston, and one afternoon, after taking a scenic drive into the countryside, we decided to drive down this rugged-looking country road with high embankments on either side, heavily flanked by ubiquitous red maple and chestnut oaks, and some areas where Queen Anne's lace was growing in spots, which is viewed as the prettiest weed in the entire world, and it certainly looked attractive on the roadside. As we drove down this lovely road, I had this airy, clairvoyant hunch that I'd been here before, and it was an overwhelming sense of déjà vu. We continued along the road, which opened up into a large valley, surrounded by exquisite mountain ranges and pretty flowery meadows where horses were grazing. Like a jewel in its glistening golden crown, nestled in the heart of this valley, was quite literally the most breathtakingly beautiful house that I've ever beheld in my entire life. This was no ordinary house, as I had seen it before in my dreams, but never physically, and I'd seen it on multiple occasions, which was in itself exceedingly odd, because I wasn't hardwired to be instinctive or intuitive. "It's so beautiful," I gasped. "I have to have this home," I told my husband. "I've been here numerous times in my dreams. I know it sounds crazy and preposterous, but I promise you it's true. It's literally like the house is calling me." "Don't be ridiculous, sweetheart," said Jimmy. "You can't just buy a house that's not on the market. Someone lives here." "I'm sorry, Jimmy, but this is our home. I feel it in my gut and in every fibre of my being. This is our house. I just know it. I feel it. We have to go and see the owner and put in an offer for the home, for it's meant to be ours." My husband sighed in resignation, for he knew well that when there was a bee in my bonnet about something, that wild horses was not going to stop me in my endeavours, and there was little point in reasoning with me, because when my mind was set on something, I became as obstinate as a mule and as stubborn as a bulldog. "Very well," he said, "but don't you dare bite my head off if the owners don't want to sell this piece of paradise to us. I know if I was wearing their shoes, I most certainly wouldn't. Who in their right mind would sell a place as exquisitely stunning as this? I know I would hold on to this place for dear life if I owned it. We continued on our way until we arrived at a large open cattle gate with a sign which read Silver Birch Grove, and so we drove through the gate, down a very large precipitous embankment until eventually the ground flattened out and the road became very even. Before long we were parked outside a stunningly magnificent home. We both sat in the car and literally gasped. Close up, the house was even more prepossessing and arresting than we had previously envisaged, and was in remarkably good condition. It was a 3-story square-shaped colonial home, with a door located in the centre, with the same number of double-hung sash windows on either side. It was possibly built in the 18th century, or even earlier, and it looked as fresh as the day its foundations were first laid, which in itself was rather astonishing. It was as if every single brick in the house had absorbed its rich, colourful history, rather like a sponge, enveloping the place in a beguiling character, charm and presence that can only ever be acquired over many centuries. An old woman with short, curly, silvery hair, a very peachy skin and pale blue eyes, who was clad in a stylish white pair of cotton pants and a soft, flowing navy blue top, complemented by a long string of glistening pearls, was carrying a white fluffy dog under her arm, much like a clutch bag, came out of the large front door. "That must be the owner," I said to my husband. "I think she looks very nice, an agreeable old lady, who just might agree to sell us this house." "Don't get your hopes up," said Jimmy, looking very concerned. "I couldn't bear for you to be disappointed." "Just you wait and see," I told him. "This house is definitely ours. I feel it in my bones." The woman, although old in years, stood tall and proud, watching us as we parked our car, and she graciously ambled towards us with a great big welcoming smile upon her face, and as strange as this sounds, she looked heartily relieved to see us, almost as if she'd been expecting us for quite some time, and it would appear I was not wrong in my assumptions. "I've been expecting you for a very long time, and finally you're here," she told us, and promptly invited us into her living room, where she prepared us hot cups of tea with delicious steaming melt-in-the-mouth cheese scones, fresh from the oven, served with layers of delicious fresh butter. "I'm so glad you came," she said. "My name is Enid Rochester. It's so lovely to meet the both of you. Please make yourself at home. I won't lie, I did actually wonder if you'd ever get here, and my faith was challenged and waned on multiple occasions. Yet the good Lord never fails to deliver on his promises, and here you both are. I hope you're going to put in a good offer for this house, because I'm not going to settle for peanuts, not even for a really nice couple like yourselves. It always strikes me as peculiarly odd that we have to pay for everything on this planet of ours. It's something I've never understood. If there are other worlds out there in this galaxy, which I strongly suspect there are, I doubt they have to pay for a thing on their planets. You would think it was our God-given birthright to have everything for free, but needs must. Otherwise I would give you this house for nothing in a heartbeat. I can assure you of that, because you are the perfect couple for this house." I gasped. "How could you possibly know I want to buy your house? I'm amazed you should know this. It is true, but I don't know how you could possibly know that." "Well, I've been praying for the good Lord to send me the right couple to buy this house, and here you are. But you certainly took your time in getting here. I would be damned if I was going to settle with some estate agent, and so I put the matter in God's hands, and finally you're here. The house has been in my family line for generations, but my son didn't want to inherit the home, which is very unfortunate. But he's living in the south of France with his French wife, and they grow vineyards and produce the most excellent wine. I didn't want to sell the house to just anybody. Even houses have feelings, and this one is very particular. Not just anybody can live here, you know. I know you've been sent here, and so I can entrust my house to your charge. Do I need to show you around the place, or did you get an overview of it in your dreams?" "You know that I've been dreaming about your house?" I asked. How could you know that? Are you psychic? Because, my dear, how would you know you wanted to buy the house if you'd never been shown around it in the first place? Do you think it's an accident you were led here today? I highly doubt that, my dear. You've clearly seen the house in your dreams. All that happened over 2 long years ago, and my husband and I were settled in happily into our new colonial home, and I was beginning to enjoy and relish my brand new lifestyle. We had several fabulous-looking horses grazing in the meadows, and a large herd of heifers, a couple of barns, a stable block, and 2 incredibly stunning-looking ponds. But my favourite part of the house was the extensive wood green that flanked the rear of our property, because there are no words to describe how uplifting this place was. Even Enid Rochester, who sold us the house, told us that her great-grandfather had suffered from severe bouts of depression from time to time. I gathered that he always took a stroll in the wood green as a remedy to recover from his flagging mood, and the black cloud and heaviness over his heart dissipated every single time, and I could understand why. For me it was almost as if the wood green was magical, as it was so alive with birdsong and indigenous animals like squirrels, foxes, raccoons, rabbits and deer. It was a marvellous shaded retreat, a glorious place where very old trees with hefty curvaceous trunks embraced the skies in a regal repose and splendour, and where the forest was infused with a delicate light that filtered through the trees, and even the floor was resplendently furnished with lacy ferns, wild violets, creeping juniper, and pretty flowering creepers. And there was a stream that meandered through the woods with crystal clear water that drew the animals into the wood green for a much-needed drink. Sometimes I'd concealed myself behind some of the large, rocky sculptural boulders that surrounded the stream, many swathed in a velvet carpet of emerald green moss, and I would sit and watch the deers drinking at the water's edge, and that was a sight that would have made the hardest heart melt like butter. My story that ultimately led to my Bigfoot encounter happened when my husband and I were incurring a little trouble with the plumbing in our kitchen. I was having issues with the water output in the tap of the main sink on the central island. My husband called out a local plumber, who was a man called Rick Montague. The moment I laid eyes on this man, he sent chills down my spine, and my hair stood on edge, and even my Scottish terrier Duke clung to me like a limpet, spurning the desire to go near this irksome man, and he had never behaved in this fallacious way before, as normally he was very friendly towards strangers, but certainly not on this occasion. There was nothing unwanted or abnormal about this man that had set the alarm bells ringing in my head. I would describe him as pretty nondescript, prosaic and unremarkable looking really. He was in his late 30s with a receding hairline, square jaw, and deep-set brown eyes that were as beady as a raven's. You really got the distinct impression that he was studying everything and missing nothing, which was invasive and unsettling to say the least, giving me a heightened feeling of discomposure. I did notice that he had a tiny blue tattoo of a snake on his wrist, almost like a bangle, which I thought rather strange, as who on earth places a tiny tattoo on their wrist? "So what's been giving you problems, ma'am?" he said, going over to the central island and popping his head directly under the cupboard beneath the sink, whilst opening up his large, sizable box of tools and retrieving what looked like a spanner or a screwdriver. "The water output is exceedingly bad," I said to him. "The sink's not draining efficiently, and the tap drips incessantly." The man began to examine the sink. He glanced at me several times, as if measuring me up like a joint of sirloin or fillet that he wished to buy at the butcher's, which did make me feel ever so uncomfortable and very self-conscious. "Nice place you've got here, ma'am. Must have cost you a bob or two. I notice those horses in the field are fine specimens. And let's face it, you have a herd of spectacular-looking heifers. You clearly know your farm business." "Thanks," I said. "I grew up in Texas. I know a thing or two about horses and heifers. I was raised on a ranch." "I suppose that makes a lot of sense. You must have learnt a lot on that ranch." So you're from Texas, are you? I don't think I would have guessed that straight up. There's some big money in that part of the world, mind you. Lots of wealthy landowners, and plenty of oil barons and tycoons. Probably explains why you could afford to splash out on such a resplendent place like this. Your house is like a palace. We got it at a good price, I said. I think your problem is fixed, ma'am, he said. You'll be paying cash, is that right? I can't say that there was any major problem with your sink. I just needed to put in some washers and replace a loose fitting that was rather cracked. I called my husband Jim to settle with Rick, while I made myself scarce. I was always very uncomfortable with paying people, so I quickly ventured outdoors to feed the chickens as an excuse. I observed the man finally getting into his truck that was labelled Rick Montague's Plumbing. No job is too small on his logo. I noted a slight look of concern on my husband's face, and I walked over to him and asked him why he looked so troubled. We watched the man driving away down the driveway. That man is seriously weird, he said. What do you mean by that? I asked. Well, I went off to get payment from my safe in the study, and I removed the painting off the wall, you know, the one, to open it. And I was grabbing some cash from the chamber when I happened to turn around, and the plumber was standing right there watching me. You are joking, I said. You mean he followed you from the kitchen to your study, and he saw the safe and all the cash you keep in there? Oh, my God, that's terrible. I thought there was something rather shifty about him, and he kept babbling on and on at me about what a lovely place we have out here, and how much everything must have cost, and he was harping on about the quality of our heifers and horses. He was far too inquisitive for my liking. That does sound very dodgy, said my husband. I mean, why did he not wait in the kitchen for me to come and pay him? I think he exhibited outlandish, dubious behaviour, following me into the study like that. I got the shock of my life seeing him standing there when I retrieved the cash from the safe. Would you believe it? He had the audacity to say, "Good hiding place to keep your money." The man is very peculiar, I admitted. I sensed it from the beginning. He had the creepiest eyes that just looked through you, in an invasive, sinister way. He gave me the creeps. Should I be worried? Asked my husband. The man knows where my safe is, and has seen that I keep thousands of dollars in cash on the property. I just think you should never use the man for our plumbing again, I said. He's probably pretty harmless, and we're reading way too much into the situation. Little did I realise that those words would come back to bite me. One evening at about 10:30 at night, while my husband and I were on the ground floor in the television room, sitting on the couch together and watching a very funny comedy on television. I was wearing my pyjamas and Duke was sitting on my lap. My little dog suddenly sat up very still and began to growl, and his ears perked up and his tail tucked itself tightly between his legs, informing me at once that something was up. That was when we heard someone slamming on the front door really violently hard. It wasn't a gentle, accommodating knock, but rather a demanding, forceful one that was really rather disturbing. "Let me go and see what it is, sweetheart," he said to me, kissing me on the cheek. "You stay there," he said, closing the door behind him. "I won't be long." I could hear my husband at the door, and a man's raised voice mentioning something about a car tyre being flat, and my husband said something about getting jumper leads. I remember sighing, thinking, what now? And then I could hear several feet shuffling in the entrance hall, and my husband saying, "What's this about? No, stop! Leave me alone! Stop! What are you doing? Please, no, stop! Stop! What are you doing?" My heart sank. I knew instinctively something was up, and a terrifying chill ran down my spine. I heard a voice saying, "Is your wife at home?" And my husband said, "No, she's at her sister's house." "Get on with it," came the voice. "Show us the money now, or the worms will be eating you in an hour's time. Now, where's the money? Show us the safe." At that moment I heard several gunshots, and in that instant I knew my husband was definitely dead, and I was appalled. No one could survive that many shots. He was beyond help now, as nothing could possibly save him. I was certain of that. "Search the house. See if there's anything you want to sell, and we'll load up the van in the back with all the stuff. There's lots of valuables, so go through all the jewellery. Look through everything. Paintings, valuable furnishings, anything like that." I then heard someone shrieking with delight. "There's $30,000, bro, inside the safe. Who keeps that kind of money in their home?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The men began to chuckle with laughter. I quickly grabbed my dog under my arm and ran through the sliding door on the patio, and was so grateful that my dog wasn't yapping, or my cover would most certainly have been blown. My heart was pounding violently in my chest as I stealthily ran across our backyard, past the silvery pond towards the wood green, which was the only place to hide out until the men were finally gone. I was exceedingly grateful that it was a light night with a full moon and a scattering of silvery stars, as I've always been terrified of the dark since I was a little girl, and hiding out in the forest in the dead of night was most certainly not for the faint-hearted, especially not for me. Finally I reached the woods, and I ambled towards the stream, and hid behind my favourite boulder that is shaped like a massive pair of shoulders, and has always been very comforting to me. I lay low on the ground that was heavily fringed by long brush, and I hankered down in the soft grass, cradling and massaging my dog, who was so terribly frightened, and had become exceedingly quiet. I'd never seen Duke behave like this before, except during thunderstorms, which he's terrified of. He was a sensitive dog at the best of times, and he knew something quite terrible had happened at the house. I suddenly realised I was crying. I could feel the salty tears just falling down my face like heavy raindrops, and before I knew it, I began to sob and sob and sob and cry like I've never cried before. The idea that I'd never see Jimmy again invoked in me this overwhelming sense of emptiness, and a monumental sense of despair and loss. Why did they have to kill my precious husband, I thought angrily. Why could they not have taken the money and just run? I could live with that, because material things were replaceable, but Jimmy most certainly wasn't. I think my cries were louder than I envisaged, because suddenly I sensed I wasn't alone, and I remember thinking, "Oh my God, my husband's killers have followed me into the wood, and I'll be shot dead next." I could feel my back being tapped very gently, as though someone was trying to get my attention. When I looked up through my red eyes and salty tears, I saw the largest creature that I've ever seen in my entire life. I mean, this thing was quite literally colossal. It was 8 foot tall and 700 pounds, and it was burly and barrel-chested with large floppy breasts, and covered from head to toe with long hair that draped the body like a shaggy rug. So human was this creature in appearance that I was utterly astonished, and yet there were anomalous features that were less human, like the extraordinary length of the arms and the unusual dome shape of the head. With those two exceptions taken into consideration, this creature was like a giant wild woman, and I could see her deep dark eyes studying me very curiously, but with a grave concern. The strange, incredulous creature, whatever in God's name she actually was, seemed troubled, perturbed, and even rather dismayed by my emotional state. She seemed so eager to help me. Truly, I should have been terrified of this gargantuan, imposing beast, but her countenance was so gentle, kind, and serene, and she appeared very discerning. I sensed she knew that my heart was broken and that my hope seemed lost. She identified with those raw emotions as if she too had once experienced a measure of despairing sadness herself, and could relate to my obvious distress. My tears dried up. I forgot my pain for a moment, as it was momentarily suppressed and hijacked by the incredible curiosity I had for this creature. I was amazed that even my dog Duke was not remotely afraid of her, as he promptly tottered over to her, as if she'd been his lifelong friend, and she ran her large hands through his coat, giving him a much-appreciated scratch, which he thoroughly enjoyed. The critter went away for a moment and returned with a deerskin full of berries, and we sat together and ate them, and the sweetness of the fruit was amazingly calming and uplifting. I now understand fully why sugar is so necessary in times of distress. The critter chatted away to me, like she would a friend, even though she knew I didn't understand a word she was saying. But I have to tell you, the words she spoke were incredibly comforting and reassuring. Whatever the wild woman spoke was very definitely an audible language, but the gentle tone of her soft voice was so soothing and melancholy. And before long I fell asleep in the brush, curled up in a fetal position, with Duke nestled in my chest, snoring softly. I woke up to find the morning had suddenly broken, as a soft luminescence filtered through the trees and dappled the floor in flecks of light, much like you'd see on a crystal ball or a disco light, in the kind of prisms that you see in the pretty moving dots of colours. The wild woman was sitting down with her large torso propped up against a tree trunk, just watching and observing me. I got the sense she'd been guarding me throughout the night, and when I looked up she eyed me with these warm, benevolent, congenial eyes. I felt so pleasantly warm and cosy, despite the fact that there was a cool breeze blowing mellowly through the trees, and it was like the branches were swaying so delicately, with a graceful, almost poetic rhythm, and I'd never seen the forest more beautiful in my entire life. I looked up towards the stream, and saw a mother doe and her fawn drinking at the water's edge, and they didn't seem unhinged by our presence on the opposite side of the bank. Everything was exquisite, and the wild woman made me feel so safe and secure and protected. I didn't want to return home, for this place was exquisite, and I knew our colonial house was now a site of a grisly crime. I couldn't bear the thought of returning back home to see my husband's dead body in a heap on the floor. I closed my eyes tightly, trying to shut out those hideous thoughts, and fell fast asleep again. All of a sudden I was awoken to my husband's voice calling me. At that moment I thought I had to be dreaming. No, this couldn't be true. My husband was definitely dead. But the sound got ever closer, and I could hear my husband's footfall walking through the woods. The wild woman looked at me and nodded, and then she just glided away. "Sandra!" my husband called. "Duke! Duke! Sandra! Sandra! Where are you?" Then I saw him, larger than life, standing beside a large oak tree in the heart of the wood green. I'd never seen him look more handsome in my entire life, and my eyes gazed at his wavy brown hair and bright hazel eyes. He stopped for a moment and said nothing, and neither did I. We stared at each other, as if seeing each other for the very first time, and then in an instant we ran towards each other and embraced in each other's arms, and he lifted my legs up to his hips and whirled me around and around, as if we were on a merry-go-round. I looked up to see the wild woman glancing at us beyond the trees, and she looked genuinely happy for me, as if she could sense the energy of my joy, and my mood had changed. I noted she was keeping Duke busy by giving him another back scratch, and he appeared to be in seventh heaven. "I thought you were dead," I said to my husband. "I heard gunshots. No one could survive that. I ran into the woods to hide while those men ransacked our home. What happened?" Fortunately, the gunshots were only fired yards away from me. It scared the hell out of me, I have to say. It was their way of saying, "We mean business," and if you don't do what we say, you're as dead as a dodo." "So they didn't shoot you at all?" "No, they dragged me to the safe, forced me to open it. Then they grabbed the money. They put tape over my mouth, and they bound the back of my arms and legs with it. One man stood guarding over me. He was holding the rifle to my head all the time. I noticed the men were all wearing black balaclavas, but I saw one of them had a snake tattoo on his wrist that I observed immediately. That happened when the material of his long-sleeved T-shirt lifted up." "Oh, my goodness," I said. "It was that nefarious plumber. What was his name? Rick Montague, that's right. He was behind all this. I knew that man couldn't be trusted. How on earth did you get free from your shackles?" "Well, the men were all packing up the truck with all our expensive stuff, the television, silverware, jewellery, you name it, art pieces and vintage furniture. And then out of the blue the police arrived on the scene and surprised all the men. They were all arrested and cuffed and taken to the station." "My word! I don't understand. No one could have possibly known we were in trouble." "Well, someone did," said my husband. "It was Enid Rochester. You know, that lovely old woman we bought the house from. It turns out that she has a one-way phone line to God. I gather she has amazing visions. She sees things, and the sheriff has used her in numerous police investigations to arrest people." "You're joking," I said. "No, I'm not," said my husband. "The sheriff told me that Enid once contacted him to tell him that she had a vision that the old church had been set alight by an embittered member of the congregation who had an axe to grind with the pastor there. And sure enough, she was right, and the church was rescued from being burnt down. Another time she told the sheriff that a youth was vandalising a graveyard, and the sheriff arrested the young man responsible, who was spraying the graves with red swastikas. Last night, when those insidiously evil men knocked on our door, Enid was having visions that her old house was being robbed, and she said the man causing the burglary had a snake tattoo on his wrist. She phoned the sheriff to tell him, and he sent backup to our house immediately." "My word," I said, "that woman seriously has a gift. That's incredible." Then I proceeded to tell my husband my amazing story. Whatever way you look at it, I'm inclined to think we were being angelically protected. All these years later, my husband and I still live in our colonial home. We have 2 grown-up daughters that have now flown the nest. And I know that the creature I encountered that night was a Bigfoot, who my daughter claims to have seen when she was a little girl, and she told me the creature was very inquisitive about her. She told me she was never afraid and described the creature as magnificent, lofty and majestic. I do wonder if she saw the wild lady that helped me on that inauspicious night. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Penelope Blackwood, and I was born and raised in the Pacific Northwest. And when I got married to my husband Russell in 1994, we both moved into the double-storey cottage in the far left-hand corner of his parents' sizable ranch. Russell's parents still resided in the main 1800s farmhouse where my husband had grown up as a young boy, and they ran their horse ranch from the main homestead that was exceedingly well equipped and furnished with premier stable blocks and storage barns. There was a long, smooth tarmac road that led to the main house, with 2 signs, one that pointed straight ahead, which was signposted with the words "Saddled Horse Ranch," and the other one strategically pointed down the fork turning in the road, which was signposted with the words "Green Orchard Cottage." When you turned down that little rugged, precipitous road, it led to our 1800s cottage that had belonged to the original caretaker of the land, along with his family, in the 1800s. This delightful, charming abode was steeped and marinated in a rich, vibrant history that remained on the land like a long-lost, forgotten friend, vacant, neglected and unused for over 50 long years. So my husband and I had jazzed up the place, reviving, reawakening and recapturing its original essence with some fresh paint, whilst restoring some of the damaged ceilings and a few other little maintenance jobs to bring the cottage up to speed.
We even added on a wraparound porch in keeping with the style of the cottage, in order to be able to enjoy and appreciate the ravishing panoramic views over the pretty bridged creek, the mountains and the forest. I think Russell and I were secretly hoping to enjoy a spot of bird watching from that porch from time to time. Once the very moderate renovations were at last complete, the cottage was incredibly beguiling. It was like we had brought it back to life from the dead, like a blackened old silver kettle that had been heavily tarnished over years of forsaken neglect, and had been buffed up to its former magnificent glory. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say it would not have looked out of place on a box of Swiss chocolates, because it was so magical and enchanting, and was more in sequence with something out of a poetic, whimsical fairy tale than our reality. Even my husband would joke to me and say, "Where are the fairies? And the elves, sweetheart? They ought to be around here somewhere." I knew exactly what he meant, because if fairies and elves are real, our character-rich cottage would be the quintessential place for them to be found. The cottage was a white-bricked home with a stone facade, and was heavily flanked by the most incredible dreamy alpine forest. These robust statuesque trees clung to the mountains on the rear of our property, rather like oysters on a rock, covering them in a dreamy, verdant, bushy ombrage. On the right-hand side of our property were pretty flowery meadows, where my husband's father's horses would be trotting around the fenced-in fields and grazing the pastures happily. I loved watching those horses. It was such a joy for me, and they would often lean over the fence, hoping for an apple or a carrot from me, and they were rarely ever disappointed, as I was always willing to oblige them with a treat. Russell and I were exceedingly excited to move into this vibrant, beautiful cottage, and I couldn't have asked to live in a more appealing, romantic space that I had transformed with eclectic pieces of vintage furniture that were harmonious to the cottage's rich history. I've always been a very down-to-earth person who's never believed in ghostly phenomena or the paranormal before, but I assure you, the moment we moved into the property, I sensed a presence of, or energy if you like, in our home, but I thought I was going mad and was imagining things. Sometimes I would hear heavy footfall walking down our sweeping staircase, or I would turn around to look at who was coming, and there would be nobody there. Yet I could almost feel someone there looking at me. Was I going stark raving mad, I would wonder to myself, over and over again. Then there were of course multiple occasions where in my peripheral vision I was almost certain I discerned a fleeting shadow, but once again when I turned around to look, I could see nothing. If that was not disturbing enough, there were times when my golden retriever Carmiel would rise up on his haunches, wagging his tail profusely and barking happily, as if he was greeting someone joyfully, but we saw no one standing there. One day when I was standing at the kitchen sink, washing dishes after dinner in the early evening, when it was still relatively light outside, I happened to glance outside the kitchen window and could see a man walking towards the bridge on the creek, which in itself was decidedly odd, because this man should have been nowhere near our property, as it was private land. But he was wearing clothes indicative of another time, and he had an eccentric-looking walrus moustache on his face, growing down the outer edges of his mouth, which was an unusual feature in itself for our modern times, and not something you most commonly see in our day and age. I quickly ran towards the lake, calling after the strange man, "Hi there! Can I help you? Sir, can I help you?" The man stopped for a moment and turned around, looking directly at me, with a warm smile on his face that was so charming and prepossessing. All of a sudden, his image just suddenly faded, dematerializing before my eyes like a vaporous mist, and 1 second he was there, and then he was gone. I was suddenly hit with the stark, awesome revelation and confounded realization that I had seen a ghost. I mean, what else could it possibly have been? I was so bemused and flummoxed that I kept saying to Russell over and over again, "Oh my goodness, I'm almost certain I've just seen a ghost." I was later to learn from Russell that he had seen the ghost of the caretaker very frequently as a young child growing up, especially when he'd been playing around the creek with his younger siblings. "Why on earth didn't you tell me about the ghost of the caretaker?" I asked him. "Because, Penelope, sweetheart," he had piped, "you are the most cynical person I've ever met. I knew I wouldn't convince you of such a thing as ghosts, So I figured out to myself that the caretaker would make himself known to you sooner or later, and only then would you believe. He's been haunting this land for many centuries, and everyone who lives here has seen him, and it was only a matter of time before you saw him too." "Why is he still hanging around here?" I asked my husband. "Perhaps he's attached to the land," my husband suggested. "After all, he was the original caretaker here. I've never got the impression he's unhappy or lost. I think he enjoys hanging around and watching over the place. Maybe he believes he's still managing the affairs of the homestead from beyond the grave. My father swore once that the ghost had woken him up when one of the horses was struggling to give birth, and thanks to the caretaker, mother and foal were absolutely fine. Another anomalous thing that happened in our household is that I lost things from time to time, like my reading glasses, for example. I would look everywhere for them, which was a regular event for me, as I can be rather scatterbrained at the best of times. Invariably, I would magically find them replaced on my pillow, and this happened with everything from keys to credit cards to even a small garden trowel that I lost once and couldn't find anywhere. As a result, I promptly decided that the ghost of the old caretaker, whom had lived in the cottage in the 1800s, was still taking care of things from beyond the grave, and I never regarded his presence in our home as unwanted or unpleasant. In fact, I believed his presence was welcome, as the ghost was more of a help rather than a hindrance. I gather his name was Gabe Beswick, and so if I sensed he was around, I would say, "Hello, Gabe." If I'd lost something, I would say, "Gabe, I'm missing my tweezers. Have you seen them?" Sure enough, I would find them later perched on my pillow. I think the ghost of Gabe rather liked me, because I promised you on birthdays and Christmases without fail I would find a pretty wild flower or rose on my pillow, and this is still going on this very day. So my husband teases me relentlessly and tells me that my secret admirer is not of this world, and this is a long-standing joke with all our family members. My story that ultimately led to my Bigfoot encounter happened in 2015, when my son Adam was turning 13 years old at the time. It all began when we decided to throw a fabulous party for Adam during the summer months, as the delightful weather was fabulously sunny, so it was the perfect occasion to host the most spectacular, wonderful party for him under the stars, along with a tented sleepover for the kids. My husband Russell hitched up a large tent for this purpose, and the guests were always asked to bring along their sleeping bags and pyjamas. Even a dance floor had been hired and was placed outside on the lawn, along with a pre-programmed stereo system for all the music. I do remember we lit up pretty paper lanterns everywhere to light up the entire yard. It looked magical and welcoming that night. There was a large fire pit and a carcass of lamb and pork cooking on the spit, and the delicious aroma from the food wafted over the entire countryside, ensuring that every single stomach was rumbling, and the people more than a little eager to eat the tender, succulent cuts of melt-in-the-mouth meat. The whole lawn was decked out with tables and chairs, swathed in white tablecloths with hot air balloons tied to the chairs. My sister Janine had arrived from Florida with her husband and her 16-year-old son Jonathan, who was staying with us at the time. Unfortunately, Jonathan was a belligerent, pugnacious and confrontational teenager who was always getting into all kinds of trouble and was rather a negative influence on my son at the best of times. On the day of the exciting party, my sister and I were preparing all kinds of delicious, sumptuous salads and dishes in the kitchen, along with a very large fruit punch made with passion fruit, lemonade, pineapple and orange juice, and ubiquitous pieces of chopped fruit. My son had insisted that this was the main drink he wanted to serve at the party, as it tasted absolutely delicious. "Oh, I sincerely hope Jonathan is not up to something mischievous and roguish," said my sister, looking at me ever so uneasily. "Have you noticed the way he and Adam have been whispering to each other non-stop all day and giggling? Oh, when Jonathan behaves like a delinquent and starts giggling all the time, I get a distinct chill down my spine. I sense he has a huge prank up his sleeve, and believe me, you don't want to be on the receiving end of one of his puckish jokes. It's a wonder my hair hasn't turned white from all the stress that kid's put me through." "You never told me any of this," I said, looking at my sister in horror. "What kind of pranks are we talking about, Janine?" "Believe me, you don't really want to know," said Janine. "I don't think I should tell you. It might scare you half to death." "Do I want to know?" I piped. "Of course I want to know, Janine. We're having a 13-year-old party, and the last thing I want to do is upset a bunch of overprotective parents whose kids have been scared half to death by one of your son's frolicsome jokes. I'll never live it down when I pick up Adam after school at the gates. I assure you, some of his friends' parents are stick in the muds at the best of times. The last thing I need is to be assaulted by an avalanche of disapproving looks and underhand whispers, not to mention derogatory comments." "Well, wait until Adam gets to 16 years old," sighed Janine, "and then you'll see what I'm going through. I don't know, maybe it's just my son and his rampaging hormones, but his impish jokes have really been giving me some major scares. Last week I came home from my weekly shopping at Walmart, armed with my shopping bags, and as I was walking into the kitchen, this huge crocodile came sliding towards me on its belly, pushing its body forward with his clawed feet, and its wide jaws were half open, exposing its pernicious, perilous, razor-sharp teeth. Its large, jagged tail was thrashing violently across my kitchen floor. I was so terrified that I dropped all my shopping bags, splattering the floor with broken eggs and spilled milk. I ran out of there so fast, screaming at the top of my lungs, and Jonathan and his best friend Nicholas were almost wetting themselves, they were laughing so much at my frenzied reaction and frantic outcry. They really got off on scaring me half to death. It wasn't even remotely funny. I'm sure it wasn't. Where did that crocodile come from? I asked, looking absolutely appalled. I have no idea, Penelope. I don't ask him those kind of questions, said Janine, oscillating her arms in frustration. Frankly, Penelope, the less I know, the better, as far as I'm concerned. You're scaring me, I said. I couldn't handle it if he did something cocky and impudent at Adam's party. Oh, please speak to him on my account, Janine, I'm begging you. Tell him that he'll be on the receiving end of my wrath if he does anything untoward and inauspicious at this party of mine. I'm glad to say the party appeared to be going swimmingly well. Well, so I thought at the time, based on my seemingly ambiguous and pseudo-appearances that on the surface gave me the distinct overall impression that everybody appeared to be having a remarkably good time, dancing, drinking and eating to their heart's content. The ambience was very energised, relaxed and convivial. It would seem that the kids were piling their plates up with delicious food as if they hadn't eaten for months and were frankly half-starved. It also appeared that the fruity punch had been more than a huge hit, for everyone was drinking it with an unquenchable thirst, and so my sister made several more buckets of the stuff. I was mortified to see that my golden retriever had been given punch in his water bowl, but he seemed to have enjoyed it, which in itself was rather peculiar. It was only after one of the young 13-year-old girls, a girl called Abigail Fletcher, approached me giggling happily and slurring her words, that I realised suddenly that something was seriously off. Mrs. Blackwood, this is the best party ever. It's a great, great party. All of a sudden, she promptly vomited over my dress. I was now drenched in this pixated young girl's vomit, and in disgusted revulsion, I promptly dashed upstairs, quickly showering and getting changed into something else. When I returned downstairs, I could see that there were several young 13-year-olds passed out on the lawn, clearly completely comatose, and this informed me that the kids had definitely been drinking alcohol. There was no other explanation for this outlandish behaviour. The kids, in their spaced-out, intoxicated stupor, were literally staggering around aimlessly and giggling at everything, finding the most ordinary mundane things hilariously amusing. 2 kids were pointing at my garden hose. It's going to burst with water, and then we'll be wet. And they doubled over with laughter. Even my own sister Janine should have been ashamed of her behaviour, as she was about as much help as a boiled lobster. She was sitting on a sofa, seemingly inebriated, drinking copious amounts of punch, and telling me, this is really good, sis." She slurred between several hiccups and giggles. "It's really good." I so wish my husband and brother-in-law were on hand to help me, but after having carved the meat and set up the stereo system for me, they had subsequently made themselves scarce and gone away fishing together for the rest of the whole weekend. This was a complete, total and utter disaster as far as I was concerned, and everybody was bladdered, with one exception, and that is yours truly. I wasn't quite sure how to handle this precarious situation that was getting more out of hand with every passing minute. The punch had clearly been heavily spiked, and I immediately ventured towards the huge bucket to test it myself, and circumspectly tasted the suspicious concoction. That seemed rather fine. I couldn't detect any evidence or obvious telltale signs of alcohol, but I gingerly discerned a glass bottle surreptitiously poking out from beneath the tablecloth, and to my total dismay there were dozens of empty bottles of vodka that had been hidden from discerning adult eyes. How much alcohol had these kids been drinking? I wondered in horror. I knew who the obvious offenders and perpetrators of this juvenile, insidious, duplicitous crime were, and they were no other than my nephew Jonathan and my son Adam. However, when I went to reprimand both boys, they were as responsive as a pair of groggy, dazed, hibernating squirrels, and were lying passed out on the lawn, perched up against the tent next to my golden retriever Carmiel, who was lying on his back, snoring loudly, exposing his fleshy belly. For goodness sake, even my own dog was completely pickled. Could things get any worse than this? I tried to arouse my ossified, bombed-out dog, but his eyes rolled back in his head and he glanced up at me briefly and began to snore even louder. Louder than I've ever heard him snore before. Although passed out, he did look exceedingly content and very cock-eyed. All of a sudden I felt a cold hand on my back, and it was so icy I felt as if I'd been hit by a blast of freezing cold air, which was very discernible as it was a very warm evening. I turned around to see he was trying to get my attention, but no one was there. And then in my ear I heard an audible, deep guttural male voice saying, "The creek! The creek! Get to the creek!" In hindsight, I vehemently believe to this day that this was the spectral voice of the ghostly caretaker, Mr. Gabe Beswick, alerting me to a potential problem on our land. Oh my goodness, I thought, and the horror and sense of foreboding that engulfed my very being was unlike anything I've ever yet experienced in my life before, and truly hope never to ever experience again, as once in a lifetime is just way too much for me, thank you very much. I could taste the sickly, bitter nausea rising up in the back of my throat. It was one thing for a bunch of 13-year-olds to end up 3 sheets to the wind, but it was quite another for a lone kid to fall into water in a drunken stupor. This was not something I could have on my conscience, for if one of my son's classmates drowned on my watch, how would I ever be able to live with myself? I sprinted towards the creek, and that was when I saw him. There, standing on the bridge railing, balancing on it ever so precariously, as if walking on a tightrope, was a young boy called Christopher Markham, whose arms were held up high at shoulder level, and he was clearly impaired by his inebriated, mellow state of mind, and seemed to be rather enjoying himself, and was chuckling under his breath. "I can fly! I can fly like a bird! Like a bird on the wind! I'm as light as a feather!" In that moment I was overwhelmed with terror. This young boy was about to fall into the depths of the water, and I was in no doubt about this in my mind. He was balancing so badly. It would only take a second. And then it happened, and he plunged into the water like a large stone that just sunk to the bottom of the creek. "Oh my goodness," I screamed. "Help! Help! Someone! Help!" I cried. "Someone please help me!" I was not a great swimmer, but frantically I ran into the water in all my clothes. Luckily it wasn't too cold, but it was very dark. I could barely see a thing, and I was as blind as a bat. I began swimming around feverishly, looking for the child, but I couldn't see him or find him anywhere, and I began to scream, "Help! Help! Someone, please help me!" "Where are you, boy?" I called at the top of my lungs, but the water was so still and quiet, and the only sound I could hear was the comforting, reassuring chorus of the crickets and the frogs, along with my own hands splashing in the water. All of a sudden, I saw this gargantuan, dark, shadowy silhouette dashing past me in the creek on a pair of very powerful legs, and then diving beneath the murky depths of the water with the swift speed, grace, and efficiency of an otter. In a trice, this strange, gargantuan creature, whatever on earth it was, had retrieved the young boy and cupped its drenched body in his chest, bringing him safely towards the dry land. Everything happened so quickly, but I knew without a shadow of a doubt that I was staring at a Bigfoot. The critter's long, dark hair hung on his body in wet clumps, rather like a shaggy mop. It stood proud, tall and erect, on 2 feet, towering at the very least 7 foot tall, and possibly more, with overlong arms and powerful muscular legs. Its body was exceedingly long, lanky and lean. The chest was wide and heavily ripped with muscle definition and tension. I noted the head was shaped like a cone, folding seamlessly into the huge shoulders, and I did not discern any neck. The creature's face was not too obscure, as the light from the lanterns bounced off its silhouette, highlighting its prominent, pronounced features that were remarkably human-like, although the forehead was more sloped, and the nose very large and flat. As the Bigfoot put the soaked, bedraggled-looking child onto the ground, the child began to cough up water, and then bounced up on his 2 legs like a jumping jack, and promptly ran towards a bush, and proceeded to violently hurl up the contents of his stomach. For a second I locked eyes with the Bigfoot, and those deep-set eyes were so gentle and kind. I cannot forget how kind they were. The creature turned around, and then glided away. I could hardly believe what I'd seen, for I had never believed in the likelihood of Bigfoot existing in our reality before, but now I knew very differently, and he was my hero, for I seriously doubt I would have been able to recover that child without his help. I am almost certain that the wild, frenzied excitement of the party, along with the animated, jubilant chatter and cries of the children, the loud, blaring music, and the wafting, delicious smells on the wind of spit roast, had certainly aroused the Bigfoot's officious inquiring mind as to what on earth was going on my land, as usually it was very quiet. I believe he'd been watching us from the trees with an inquisitive interest and heightened curiosity, and when seeing a problematic situation arise, came to my immediate help, of which I'm eternally grateful, as I believe his discerning, perceptive eyes had watched our party rather like a movie unfolding, which he found a source of great entertainment, and the strange drunken behaviour of the children must have really boggled his mind, as it most certainly would mine. I threw out the rest of the seriously lethal punch, and I breathed a huge sigh of relief, as I was exceedingly thankful that the kids were finally sleeping over, as hopefully by morning they would have metabolized all that alcohol before their parents collected them and found out what exactly had happened. I was furious with Jonathan for lacing the punch with vodka. Truly, I wanted to kill him. All of a sudden, I saw a woman running towards me on the lawn. I groaned as I realised it was Alice Fletcher, who was Abigail's mother. She was the only punctilious mother who refused to allow her child to sleep over at the party. She was a very overprotective parent, and by the outraged, scandalised expression upon her face, I looked as if I was about to be challenged, antagonised, and even mauled by a very aggressive hyena, who was determined to give me a hard time. "What the heck is going on here?" she piped, looking at me with an unpugnant, captious look on her face. "You should be ashamed of yourself, Penelope. What kind of a mother are you? These 13-year-old kids are seriously drunk, and even your dog is completely sozzled. How does that even happen? I'm appalled and disgusted, quite frankly, with you. Wait until I tell all the mothers about this. You mark my words, Penelope. No one will ever be attending any of Adam's future parties. I can guarantee you about that." "You don't understand," I exclaimed. The punch was spiked by one of the kids. I said this not wanting to give her any ammunition to use against me by admitting a member of my own family was responsible for this unprecedented chaos. There's no excuse, Penelope. You're the parent. You should know what kids get up to and how naughty they are. From where I'm standing, you are definitely the guilty party. It's your responsibility as the parent to take care of them and to keep your eyes on them at all times. If they had been in my charge, I can assure you none of this would ever have transpired. I agree, I confessed. I should have guessed something was up, but I didn't, I'm afraid. The kids clearly pulled the wool over my eyes. That's no excuse, she said. I watched Mrs. Fletcher gathering her daughter Abigail and glaring at me with a hateful look on her eyes. She marched back to her car, clutching Abigail as tightly as a child clasping its teddy bear for dear life, not wanting to be parted from it for a single moment. I'd never felt so alone, abandoned and forsaken in my entire life, and from that moment on, I decided I would never ever host a children's party without my husband on side to assist me. I had fallen apart at the seams, rather like a dress that had been very badly sewn together. Looking back over that party, I truly realised that I was incredibly naive at the time, in overseeing all these young teenagers, because you really do need eyes at the back of your head like a hawk. The party guests, including my dog, thankfully fully recovered from their alcoholic binge, seemingly no worse for wear. Many of the kids described Adam's party as the best party ever, which I did find rather extraordinary, given that most of their memories of the occasion were probably obliterated by the lethal punch that had knocked them for six like a powerful anaesthetic. Maybe they enjoyed the fact that they were given cake and ice cream early at breakfast the following morning, which I have to say went down exceedingly well with the children. I felt sorry for poor Jonathan, who faced my wrath. Of course, that happened when he was sober, and believe me, I laid into that boy as hard as a dog with a bone. When I told him that a young boy nearly drowned because of his wanton carelessness, that was a huge wake-up call for him, and in that moment he burst into tears as the horror about his little prank hit him hard like a brick to the head. "I could have killed someone," he wailed. "Oh, Aunt Penelope, I'm sorry. Really, I am. It was only a bit of fun. Really, it was. I didn't mean to harm anyone." I'm glad to say he's grown up a lot since then. I do owe a debt of gratitude to the ghost of the caretaker for alerting me to the problem at the creek, and of course to the Bigfoot for rescuing the drowning boy, whom I seriously doubt even remembers what happened to him and how close he came that night to losing his life. I must confess that the Bigfoot side of my story is still a big secret. I haven't told anybody about it, with of course the exception of my husband. As for Mrs. Fletcher, she ensured that the mothers knew exactly what had happened to their children at Adam's party and how intoxicated they had become. I did receive scathing looks from the parents for a while, but before long other parents began to have similar problems at kiddies' parties when they began to sneak alcohol to these events. So much for Mrs. Fletcher's famous last words, for she had declared that alcohol would never be sneaked in on one of Abigail's birthday parties. It would seem that the universe had a sense of humour after all, for it was at one of Abigail's birthday parties that the kids became seriously drunk, and so she ended up eating her own words, I'm glad to say. I'm relieved to say that after a while the fiasco of my party was soon forgotten, but for me it is an indelible event that is permanently entrenched on my memory, rather like a tattoo that is seared to the skin and can never be erased nor forgotten. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Bob and I grew up in North America in the early 70s, but I would prefer not to give the geographical coordinates of where that was for obvious reasons. Growing up, my family consisted of both my parents and my young brother Malcolm. We resided in a quaint 1700s charming cottage with whitewashed brick walls and large sash windows and a rather unique crooked chimney that was situated on a couple of acres of land. We lived in a countrified, rather remote area, surrounded by acres of dreamy forest, horse-riding trails, mountainous valleys, flowery meadows and plenty of farms, with the added advantage of being only about 15 minutes away from the main town. As a young boy, the town was a great spot to meet up with all my friends, where we would eat ice creams at the local parlour, or spend much time playing at the park. As far as any small town goes, we had our fair share of quirky, eccentric characters living among us, some that we loved to hate, most particularly the very elegantly attired unmarried Miss Maggie Peterson, otherwise known as the Magpie, for a very good reason, of course, that was only known by the locals at the time. The pencil-thin Miss Peterson was in her early 70s and was glamorous with long brown shoulder-length hair and a peachy skin that was in remarkably good condition for a woman of her advancing years. Rest assured, you would never ever find Miss Peterson dressed in anything other than star-studded party frocks that were more suited for a fancy evening at the opera than hanging around our small town or roughing it in the countryside. Everything in that woman's wardrobe was ostentatious and sparkly. She would often wear swanky and glossy gold or silver dresses, or clothes adorned with hundreds of sparkling fake diamonds or diamante crystals. Never a day in my life did I ever see that woman wear anything drab or mundane, and I'm almost certain that she only ever shopped in the glamorous evening sections of department stores. I think the harmless, gentle Miss Peterson thoroughly enjoyed putting her unscrupulous nose into everybody's business, but not quite in the way that you might imagine. Much like an investigative reporter or a foxy private eye, the tactile Miss Peterson was a hands-on sort of person. She was the kind of discerning character that would know exactly what outfit you took to the dry cleaners for cleaning, or how much you spent on your weekly shop that week, or what grade your kid got for the school math test. But she would find these things out by surreptitiously reading your school reports lying around your home, or stuffed bills that were scrunched up in a jacket pocket. It was weird, because she filled her mind with nonsensical trivia that was so meaningless and inconsequential, but to Miss Peterson it was fascinating. On reflection, I think that she found people's lives and ritzy glamorous clothes all incredibly alluring. If she visited your home, she would always open your fridge to examine the contents with her beady eyes, making a mental note of the type of mayonnaise you purchased or what your favourite brand of yogurt was, as all these little details about your life were a source of great intrigue for the likes of Miss Peterson. Another curious anomaly is that she visited the townsfolk with social impromptu surprise calls that invariably almost always meant she arrived at the most inconvenient time, which many folk believed was intentional and deliberate on her part, almost to catch you off guard. She would arrive at your place while you were running around like a bat out of hell, or were in the middle of taking a much-needed shower. Those were the times that I would hear my mother screaming, "That dreadful woman! Why won't she leave us alone? Why does she have to arrive on the scene when I have 101 things to do?" Miss Peterson would assure you that while you were picking your kids up from school, she would stay and hang around at your home and entertain herself until you got back, and she meant every word of it. I can assure you that from the moment your back was turned, you can be sure she got to work on raiding through all your stuff in a frenzied excitement and trying on any of your clothes that sparkled or were glitzy in any way. Yet despite her fervent passion and curiosity, Miss Peterson was honest, candid, forthright and incorruptible, and she would never have borrowed something from you without asking first, but that was where the boundaries began and ended for her. If she arrived at your house for tea, she would always insist on taking a much-needed trip to the ladies, and on the way there she would mischievously ferret around in all the bedrooms, having a jolly good snoop around, and if she got caught in the process, she would pretend she had lost her way, even though you had distinctly told her that the ladies was under the staircase. "Oh, I didn't hear you," she would say. "I thought you said it was on top of the stairs." It was common to find her 3 floors up in your home, presumptuously rummaging and meddling through your stuff, rather like an exuberant vagrant at a jumble sale. One of my mother's neighbours found her in the upstairs bedroom once, trying on one of her glamorous pink gold evening gowns with a rather dashing fluffy pink scarf to match, which she had placed on over her clothes, and was seen admiring her reflection in the long cupboard mirror. Upon seeing our neighbour standing in the doorway of her bedroom, staring at her in astonishment with "What the heck are you doing?" kind of expression written on her face, Mrs. Peterson would promptly pull off the dress and scarf and replace them into the bewildered neighbour's hands, as if she'd been at a cubicle at a clothing store and was rejecting the items. Not very nice, she had said, referring to the clothes. Much too brassy for my liking, I'm afraid. And then she'd looked directly at our neighbour, squarely in the eyes, as if nothing had transpired, and said, "Where did you say the ladies' cloakroom was? I completely forgot." She would give herself away by saying to me, "Bobby, how long have you been playing the flute? And how old is your hamster?" I assure you, there is no way she could have known these personal details about me without having snooped in my bedroom to begin with, as my flute was locked away in my cupboard, and my hamster was hidden in the far corner of the bedroom during the day, and his cage was always covered with a towel when he was sleeping. You pretty much knew if Miss Peterson was coming around, because she'd invariably go officiously prying, so you better had nothing to hide. Mrs. Peterson generously offered her services for babysitting completely free of charge to any of the townsfolk, possibly as an excuse to go ferreting around when unsuspecting backs were invariably turned. Many people claimed that after she'd been babysitting for them, even their mail had been tampered with, and any glamorous clothes with a hint of a sparkle were left hanging on the hangers inside out, looking ominously like they'd been tried on. Miss Peterson enjoyed trying any glitzy clothes on, or anything that sparkled, gleamed, shone, or glittered, which included people's jewellery, which was why she earned the name the Magpie by the folk in our town, as magpies are duly noted for picking up glitzy things and placing them in their nests, as just like Miss Peterson, they have an eye for anything shiny. My parents didn't really care if Miss Peterson snooped through their stuff when she visited our home, as they were pretty laid-back and easy-going sort of people at the very best of times, who pretty much wore their heart on their sleeves. And as for secrets, they didn't have any. In those days, hiring a babysitter for free was something not to be sneezed at, and so invariably Miss Peterson spent many a long night watching over us as little children, while my parents went out painting the town red. I rather liked Miss Peterson, because despite all else she was kind and caring. When Malcolm and I were little, she would tuck us up into bed and read us a bedtime story. Then later on in the evening, we would hear her surfing, rustling and rattling around through drawers and examining all our family stuff and looking through old family photographs. My brother and I would giggle to ourselves as we thought it terribly funny that Miss Peterson was such a big snoop. We knew she'd be trying on my mother's evening wear by now, or possibly reading her private diary, which was exceedingly boring, as my mother would write things in her diary like, "Pretty mundane day, rained a lot, cooked chicken hot pot roast for lunch, and visited Mum's grave." My brother Malcolm used to joke that Miss Peterson's nose would grow so long as a result of all her snooping, and the irony of ironies is that this glamorous woman with her dark chocolate beady eyes really did have a somewhat pointed beak-like nose, which I thought was very befitting for a woman known as the Magpie, which I really thought suited her down to a T. One evening after Miss Peterson had tucked us up into bed and read us our favourite bedtime story about a very happy little hippo called Wally. Then she kissed us on the cheeks good night and switched off the bedroom lights, leaving the door ever so slightly ajar. I smiled secretly to myself in amusement as I pulled the sheets over my face. She could be heard rummaging through all our family stuff, surreptitiously trying to be very quiet, to conceal her sneaking activities, but with very little success. All of a sudden I could hear Miss Peterson let out a huge, terrified scream. I sat upright in my bed and thought, did I hear that, or was I dreaming? I had been drifting off to sleep, and it was very difficult to distinguish reality from fiction. I could have sworn I'd heard her scream, but was I imagining it? I sensed something felt really off. I felt like I was gripped with a growing sense of unease. I could hear what I can only describe as a frenzied Miss Peterson charging around the house frantically, rather like a bull in a china shop, and opening up cupboards in a haste, banging doors behind her loudly. She seemed noisier than usual, almost as if she was not even attempting to cover up her insatiable curiosity. That wasn't like her at all. It was in that second I sensed something untoward was going on, and so in my pyjamas I ventured out of my bedroom. I could see Miss Peterson hurriedly bolting down the staircase in a sparkling evening gown of my mother's, wearing high-heeled silver slippers, carrying my father's hunting rifle in her hands, and dashing out of the side door as if she was in hot pursuit of something, but what she was after I couldn't imagine. What on earth was she doing, I wondered. It seemed like her behaviour was unusually odd this evening. I quickly followed her, with a growing sense of intrigue. Perhaps this nosiness lark that had consumed Miss Peterson's life was seriously infectious, and I had caught it, because now I was growing increasingly curious myself. "Go away! Shoo!" I could hear Miss Peterson shouting. "Go away! Go away, you creep! Get away! Leave!" It was almost as if she was telling a strange dog to get off the property. All of a sudden she began firing some random shots after the mystery creature with my father's rifle, and that was when I saw this huge, dark, shadowy silhouette thundering towards her like a bull charging a red flag at a bullfight. And the red flag in this scenario was no other than Miss Peterson herself, who was now screaming at the top of her lungs, "Help! Help! Please help! Help!" Whatever on earth this creature was, it appeared to be enraged and maddened. I got the distinct impression that Miss Peterson's random shooting had provoked and inflamed the situation, only making it 1,000 times worse, rather like putting petrol on a fire that was dying out anyway, and reigniting and aerating the flames, turning them into an outrageous, wrathful inferno. Everything was happening so quickly, as it invariably always does in any violent scenario, when your life flashes before you, and things take forever to unfold, when in reality what seems to last a lifetime has only been a matter of seconds, but your recall is so vividly pronounced that it is indelibly marked on your memory with such crystal clear clarity. And this is what this moment was like for me, only I was the spectator of this event rather than the victim. So for me it was tantamount to watching a movie. I remember thinking in those memorable seconds, what on earth is this extraordinary creature? I've never seen anything like it before. It ran towards Miss Peterson, its overlong arms swinging vigorously backwards and forwards, and it seemed prepped for a fight, rather like a warrior on a battlefield. This virile, Herculean creature was the size of a great giant. It was easily as tall and as wide as our front door, with such huge, powerful legs and a funny-shaped arched head. Despite some of its unusual features of this able-bodied creature, in my opinion, it did appear to possess a rather remarkable human-like profile, along with a man's face, but it was covered from head to toe with long flowing dark hair. And it smelt like petrichor, which is that earthly scent you smell after the rain falls on the soil. I actually really love that smell. As it lunged boldly and fearlessly towards Miss Peterson, it grabbed my father's rifle from her hands and bent it effortlessly backwards like some people can bend spoons with their minds. It was almost like the rifle was soft and pliable for him, much like plasticine. It threw the twisted metal into the bushes, where it disappeared into the long grass and was visibly no longer seen. Then it grabbed Miss Peterson, who was now screaming, tossing her over his gargantuan shoulders like a sack of potatoes, where I could see her tiny body wiggling wildly and her skinny legs kicking desperately to escape the critter's clutches. But his unassailable strong hands had held her down on his strapping rock-hard shoulders. They were so powerful. I knew she would never be able to escape his forceful grip, for this creature was impregnable, robust and invulnerable. In that second I was so frozen in shock that I just stared at these inopportune proceedings evolving before my very eyes, feeling almost certain that I would never ever lay my eyes on Miss Peterson again, and that she was either in the process of being kidnapped or would end up as a tasty meal for this monstrous beast. I couldn't decide what was the most likely scenario, but either way you looked at it, things were not looking favourable as far as Miss Peterson was concerned, and I was pretty certain that she was a goner at the very least. While all this was transpiring, I could hear Miss Peterson shouting, "Put me down! Put me down! Put me down!" And then her voice branched out into a series of desperate helps that sounded ominously like a yapping dog, followed by some muffled, high-pitched screams. The critter glided with her towards the old oak tree in our yard. For a second he stood very still, and hurled the frightened woman up and down in the air, exactly like a ball, catching her in his hands every time. I truly think he skillfully incorporated these cunning scare tactics in his artful manoeuvres against the poor woman to maximise her terror, and it was clearly working, for indeed Miss Peterson was so petrified that by this time she was frozen solid in fear, and uttered not a word, seemingly resigned to her inevitable fate or demise. I must confess she looked as frail, fragile, delicate and pathetic as a Barbie doll in this creature's burly arms and sizable hands. Finally he chucked her on the ground, discarding her body under the oak tree, like a piece of rejected and fallacious litter, where it rolled backwards precariously until it stopped and settled yards away from the large voluptuous tree trunk. The critter then snorted in absolute disgust, gliding away, jumping over the white wicker fence with the ease of a horse, and disappearing into the trees until it was gone from our sight, moving with a graceful agility that was seamless. For a second it was hard to process what I had observed, as it seemed far too incredulous to be real. I think I was too bewildered and dumbfounded to even be remotely scared as I should have been, for fear can easily be hijacked by complete, total and utter astonishment, as was the case with me. In haste, I bravely bolted towards poor Miss Peterson, and began to valiantly shake her body to make sure that she wasn't dead. In truth, I feared the worst, but hoped for the best. "Miss Peterson! Miss Peterson! Miss Peterson, are you all right?" The woman opened her eyes, and on seeing me peering over at her, began to scream and fight me back with her hands, thrashing me violently. "Go away! Go away! Go away!" she shrieked. "Miss Peterson! Miss Peterson! It's all right! It's only me!" It took a while for Miss Peterson to come around and compose herself, and once she'd seemingly calmed down, she sat bolt upright and looked directly at me. "Oh, it's you, Bobby," she said. "It's you. What happened?" "I think you know more about that, Miss Peterson, than I do," I said, reaching out with my hand to help her rise up from the ground, back onto her feet. And I was relieved to see that the willowy, sylph-like woman was walking with a little bit of a hobble, but was no worse for wear, as clearly nothing was broken, but she held on to my shoulders for support as we returned to the house. I led Miss Peterson to our kitchen and immediately put on the kettle, as my mother had taught me that when you've had a shock of any kind, nothing beats a cup of sweet hot tea, and at 10 years old I knew my way around the kitchen exceedingly well, and was a dab hand with making tea and offering tons of chocolate biscuits to our guests. I watched Miss Peterson sitting down on the kitchen chair, staring vacantly into space, while I prepared the tea for us. I could discern her face was as white as a sheet, and her eyes were as wide as saucers, and I could see that she was shivering like you do when you're very cold, and so I went to fetch a blanket for her, which I threw over her shoulders, and which she wrapped around her body gratefully. I handed Miss Peterson the sweet tea, which I'd loaded with 10 full teaspoons of sugar, as I figured the sweeter the better. Miss Peterson's arthritic hands were shaking, and when she held the teacup, her fingers wobbled precariously, and the tea in her cup began to move around like the waves of a tempestuous sea. "Did you see it, Bobby?" Miss Peterson asked me, studying me curiously with rounded, alarmed-looking arms. "Yes, I did," I admitted. "What was it, Miss Peterson?" I asked. "A monster! A demon! A creature from the very depths of hell," she said, looking at me earnestly. That thing! It nearly killed me. You saw it throwing me up in the air, didn't you? Like a rag doll." She grabbed my hand suddenly. Bobby, I nearly died tonight," she said. "What happened, Miss Peterson?" I asked, watching her draining the teacup in one large mouthful, which must have tasted as sickly as sugar syrup, but Miss Peterson did not seem to mind. "Nice tea, Bobby," she said. "Your mother has taught you well." I could see that the colour had returned to Miss Peterson's cheeks, and even her fingers had stopped shaking. It was only then that I noticed that Mrs. Peterson was wearing my mother's favourite dress, that was now completely ripped down the middle, and was brand new. I knew she was excited about wearing the pretty dress to a friend's wedding, and Miss Peterson had completely ruined it for her, and when my mother found out about this, she would be less than amused, but I knew better than to say anything, as Miss Peterson was very sensitive right now. "Bobby, I was in your parents' bedroom," she said. "The light was fully on. You know, dear, when you're out in the yard, that if the light's on in any room in the cottage, you can see everything that's going on in the house from the outside. I'd failed to pull the curtains, I'm afraid. Now, there's a tree very close to your parents' bedroom window, and I was trying on your mother's pretty dress and examining myself in the mirror when I sensed that I was being watched by something. It was a creepy, insidious feeling that sent horrible chills down my spine. But how could anybody be watching me, as I was alone in your parents' bedroom? Yet I could feel eyes staring at me. And then I looked towards the window, and I hadn't drawn those curtains, and that was when I saw it. It was the most massive creature standing there on a very large tree branch, watching me like a perverse peeping Tom. But whatever this thing was, it was not entirely human. And its face, it scared the hell out of me. It was like a monster, big, wide and hairy, but a face that was so human it was almost unnerving. "Was it being aggressive towards you?" I asked. "No, but it was staring at me, Bobby. It was spying on me. I felt aggrieved and offended by its impudent behaviour. It just didn't stop staring." "Well, maybe it was admiring how pretty you look in my mother's dress," I suggested. "Bobby, I don't care if it was admiring me. The thing was watching me, like a peeping Tom. It was staring." "Were you afraid?" I asked. "Well, it gave me one hell of a scare, Bobby, spying on me like that. But I didn't know what it was, and I couldn't see it too clearly, but I wanted it gone." "So you went looking for my father's rifle and went chasing after it. How did you manage to open my dad's gun cabinet in the first place? He keeps it locked to prevent accidents, and he hides the key." "Well, I know where your father keeps his key," said Miss Peterson. "He tapes it to the bottom of his desk in his study." I was exceedingly impressed, as even I didn't know where my dad kept the keys to his gun cabinet. "You're a genius," I said. "You're a super sleuth. I'd never look there for a key." When my parents got back to the house, and my mother saw every light on in the cottage, and Miss Peterson and I sitting at the kitchen table having tea at about 1 o'clock in the morning, she was far from pleased. Worse still, when she saw Miss Peterson was covered in mud and had ripped her brand new best dress to pieces, she was less than amused. "What's going on here?" she screamed. "And why is Bobby up, Miss Peterson? You know that my boys should be in bed by 8:30 sharp. You know the rules." "Your son has been a saint tonight," Miss Peterson said. "You should be proud of him. He rescued me from the beast." "What beast?" asked my mother, looking appalled. "You're not making any sense, Miss Peterson. Have you been drinking?" "Of course not," said Mrs. Peterson, looking indignant. "You know I never touch the stuff." "Well, I sincerely hope not," said my mother, eyeing her ever so suspiciously, "because I can't have anyone watching over my boys if they're surreptitiously drinking behind my back. Do you understand? I'm sorry, Mrs. Peterson, but you do sound inebriated and intoxicated. Can you categorically assure me that you haven't been drinking tonight?" "She's not drunk, Mummy," I protested. "She's just had a terrible shock, that's all." "A shock?" said my mother. "What kind of a shock? Did someone break in? Should I be calling the sheriff? You're beginning to scare me." "Nothing like that," I assured my mother. "There was a peeping Tom spying on Miss Peterson when she was trying on your dress in your bedroom." "A peeping Tom?" said my mother, looking aghast. "You mean a stranger was staring at you getting dressed in the middle of the night, of all things? Who is this vile man? We must report him to the sheriff at once. How did he manage to look into the bedroom? It's on the second floor, for goodness sake." "He was standing on the branch of the large walnut tree outside your bedroom window, looking in at me," said Miss Peterson. "He was pressing his face right against the window. His head was huge." My mother quickly opened her handbag and grabbed out a pen and paper. "Give me a detailed description. What did he look like? I'll pass it on to the sheriff pronto. The man must be caught immediately, because this could happen again, and the last thing we need is a peeping Tom in this area." I think he was about 7 foot tall and 3 foot wide at the shoulder area. He was covered in hair from head to foot, with the exception of his face. His face looked a lot like your husband's, actually. Masculine and rugged, said Miss Peterson, suddenly giggling inappropriately. Miss Peterson, you are drunk, said my mother, throwing down the pen in exasperation. I'm not going to listen to all this nonsense. 7 foot, 3 foot wide. What on earth are you talking about? Covered in hair and looking like my husband? More to the point, why are you wearing my brand new dress that you've ripped to shreds? And why were you dressing in my room in the first place? That's what I want to know. It was so pretty, said Miss Peterson. I had to try it on. It's a lovely dress. Not any more. I'm sorry. Do you have any idea how expensive it was, Miss Peterson? Said my mother. I was going to wear it to my best friend's wedding, and now, thanks to you, it's completely ruined. All of a sudden, my dad entered the room with a grim, solemn look on his face. Someone has ransacked my rifle cabinet, and my high-powered rifle is missing, he said. It was very expensive, and it's gone. Mrs. Peterson took your rifle, Dad, to run after the beast, but the creature bent it backwards and threw it into the bushes near the oak tree before it actually attacked her. How did you manage to open my cabinet, Miss Peterson? Asked my father, looking bemused. She's a super sleuth, Dad, I piped proudly. She knows exactly where you keep your key hidden, right there under the desk. Lovely, said my father, exiting the room and venturing out of doors to search for his rifle. You've some explaining to do, Miss Peterson, said my mother. Why are you making up all these crazy, preposterous stories about beasts? And what are you filling my son's head with? You're making him believe all this crazy stuff. Because what she's telling you is true, Mum, I insisted. Why would we lie to you? Miss Peterson is lucky to be alive tonight, because I saw the beast too, and it did throw her up in the air like a ball and offloaded her near the tree there. And I'm not making any of this up. I don't know what it was, but it was like a giant human being with lots of long flowing hair, and we're telling you the truth. My father entered the room very silently, carrying his bent rifle. The expression on his face was astonished. Sweetheart, I don't know what attacked Miss Peterson tonight, but I'm inclined to believe her story. No normal creature could have bent my rifle back like this. This is extraordinary. Whatever did this was incredibly strong, and it clearly was not of a human source, because no human could possibly do this. My mother looked astonished as she took my father's rifle from him and examined it, her eyes growing as round as saucers, and her jaw dropping to the ground. Oh, my goodness! Who could have done this? This is incredible! Exactly my point, said my father. Something happened here tonight, but what? I cannot imagine. A week or so after that incident, my mother received a parcel in the post, and it was a beautiful dress from Miss Peterson, far more exquisite than my mother's original dress, with a note which read, I'm really sorry for messing up your dress. I hope this will be a good enough replacement for you. My mother was well and truly humbled, because even though Miss Peterson was a nosy person with a passion for all things glitzy, she didn't have a mean bone in her entire body. She shouldn't have done this, said my mother. This is the most incredible dress I've ever seen in my life. I mean, it probably cost her a fortune. I probably already owe Miss Peterson dozens of dresses already for all the free babysitting she's done for us over the years. I do feel heartily ashamed of myself. It was about 6 months after that strange erroneous event, when my father was taking out the rubbish at night, when he stopped dead in his tracks. As watching him from the tree line was a creature that fit the description of the one that Miss Peterson and I had seen that night. My father was astounded by the dark silhouette he saw, and described the creature as benevolent and rather curious. It watched him for a while, and then turned around and glided away. He never saw it in detail, but did determine that it probably was the same creature. Looking back all these years later, I'm in no doubt that the creature that attacked Miss Peterson was a Bigfoot, but I believe he never intended to harm her, For if indeed that had been the case, it would have been nothing for him to finish her off with a single blow of his hand. I believe the Bigfoot noticed the lights in our family cottage and could see activity going on in my mother's bedroom, and was inquisitive and curious, so he climbed up the tree to have a better look, pressing his face against the glass pane, obviously scaring Miss Peterson to death. Another thing to bear in mind was that Miss Peterson was trying on a very glitzy gold sparkling dress, which must have been shimmering, and that in itself would have been very eye-catching for the creature. I think the creature was curious and intrigued by Miss Peterson, and possibly even had a soft spot for women, who knows? I imagine when she started firing after him with a rifle, he took offence to her actions, and sought revenge by tossing her in the air a few times to scare her, like she had invariably done to him, by firing after him like that, which was a grievous mistake on her part to make. So, with the exception of my father's encounter with the Bigfoot, we've never really been fortunate enough to have another encounter at our home, but I'm still hoping. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Niles, and I'm from the bluegrass state of Kentucky, where I grew up on my parents' farm in the North American countryside, with my sister Joanne, my parents, and my grandmother. I've lived here pretty much all my life, surrounded by the Appalachian Mountains to the east, dreamy forests, undulating verdant hills, exquisite horse country, silvery lakes, and quaint little country towns. I may be exceedingly biased, and I probably am, but I truly consider Kentucky to be one of the most gorgeous states in America, and I would never want to live anywhere else in the entire world. Growing up, we lived in a very old Georgian farmhouse that was as pretty as a picture, and was situated in the midst of a narrow V-shaped valley, surrounded by panoramic views of the mountains, and heavily flanked by forests, flowery meadows, fields of sagebrush, and rugged country roads. I believe my grandmother was the greatest influence in my life, for as my parents were out working in the local town, my grandmother took care of us and ran the farmhouse with a steadfast efficiency and ease. She was the most extraordinary southern cook, who made the most incredible dishes from meatloafs, brisket, chicken pot pie with bacon and cheddar biscuits, chicken gumbo, pot roast with mushroom grits, mama's fried chicken, spoon bread, derby pie, beer cheese, and the list invariably goes on and on. Growing up, my sister and I were drawn to the delicious melt-in-the-mouth aromas and smells that emanated from that kitchen, that would literally titillate our taste buds and cause our stomachs to begin to rumble with hunger. I would use any excuse in the book to remain in the kitchen, in the hope that my kindly grandmother might give me some tasty morsels to enjoy, while helping her with her cooking, and that was when my love and fascination for cooking was born. My story that ultimately led to my Bigfoot encounter began when I decided to buy a large old colonial home in Kentucky with my family, my wife Pat, and my two daughters Kate and Emma. I renovated the farmhouse and extended it to include several dozen luxurious bedrooms and bathrooms en suite, designed to be very elegant guest rooms. I created a very sizable French-style kitchen with many ovens and plenty of workspace. This idea was born because I would offer cooking classes for those with a passion for culinary arts who were interested in American cuisine while staying on our farm for about 12 days, and the courses did not come cheap. Before long, I was being booked up by interested parties from all around the globe who were eager to learn the culinary secrets of Southern cooking. I would only ever have as much as 12 guests at a time staying on our farm, and it was the most incredible experience as we met the most phenomenal people from all parts of the world. Every afternoon the class would be cooking a vast range of Southern dishes for the evening meal, and then we would gather around a very long wooden oak table, like one great big cosy family together, and enjoy our food. We would talk about the day's exciting events, whilst drinking back glasses of wine, and getting ever so slightly tiddly and mellow in the process, and many long-standing lifelong friendships seeded, rooted, blossomed and flourished from these classes. My wife's role was to take the class in the morning to various locations, like a local distillery, where they make bourbon and all-American whiskey, as 95% of the world's finest bourbon is made here in Kentucky. Our guests were taken to a local dairy, where they would enjoy tasting a large selection of American cheeses, from Rockfords to Bries, Cheddars and Gouders. My wife also took them to an all-American diner to taste some of Kentucky's favourite local dishes for a wholesome all-American Southern lunch. And then there were visits to the local town for shopping opportunities, followed by impromptu visits to local farms where you could pick your own fruit from berries to apples, which we transformed into delicious chutneys, jellies, jams and fruit pies. On one occasion I had only 8 guests staying with me on the farm, and one of them was a pretty young woman called Elsa Carlson from Sweden, who was quite tall and slim with long blonde hair, who simply adored food, and confessed to thinking about food morning, noon and night, almost all the time. At the time she was an aspiring Swedish food critic who wrote articles for local papers on various restaurants, and if your restaurant in Sweden did not get the thumbs up from Elsa Carlson, things did not bode too well for your business in the future. Elsa Carlson had one big fear. She was absolutely terrified of blowing up like a balloon as a result of all the delectable tasty dishes she was consuming day in and day out. "The trouble is I care about my waistline so much," she told me, "but I'm addicted and fixated to food, which is very important to me. I adore eating." She continued, "I frequently dream about a walrus with a wrinkled brown and pink hide, with long white tusks, grisly whiskers, and covered in all this blubber, relaxing on the seashore, bellowing and snorting loudly. In my dream, I walk over towards a spectacular, sizable walrus, who is sociable and friendly towards me. I admire how magnificent and awesome he is, as indeed he's the most colossal walrus on the beach, who has aroused a great deal of interest among all the females, who are in awe of his gargantuan, monumental size. As I walk over to this intriguing walrus, and I look into his kindly dark eyes, I realise with total astonishment and horror that I'm staring directly at myself, and I am that walrus. I was so shocked because in my dream this walrus continues to gain more and more blubber with every passing second, and I wake up in a cold sweat, hyperventilating and making sure that I haven't grown overnight. I'm so terrified of becoming that walrus and being trapped in all that blubber," she said. "As a result, I rise up at the crack of dawn to go running in order to burn off some of those calories, as the fear of becoming excessively fat consumes me like a raging out-of-control fire." Frankly, I can't say I was surprised by Elsa's blatant, honest confession. I'd heard this sort of thing before from people paranoid of becoming fat due to their insatiable love of food. It would seem in my line of business among many of the foodies, worries about weight gain are rife, and Elsa was no exception to this rule. Many I know have lost the battle with the bulge, as their pleasure of food far suppresses and hijacks their desire to manage their waistline. I would usually hear them say, "I'll have the lemon meringue pie today," and the diet will start on Monday. And when Monday came, the promises of food restriction had blown out of the window, rather like the vaporous steam of a kettle. Some of my guests have even said to me, "I would rather die happy while indulging in good food than be thin and miserable." I also hear from cigarette smokers who confess that if smoking robs them of a few years of life, so be it, as they did not desire to abandon the habit, as such is the power of addiction over our psyches. One day Elsa came in from running while everyone was seated around the table at breakfast, and I could see that she was out of breath, and her face was all drained of colour, and she began to shake like a jelly. I've never seen anyone tremble so much before, and I had a good mind to call out the doctor, but she waved her hand at me, insisting that she would be fine. "I've just had a very dreadful shock, that's all," she said, quickly reaching for the orange juice and draining the entire glass in a single sip. Everyone who'd been eating breakfast suddenly became very still and quiet. You could have literally heard a pin drop. They just stared at Elsa, as it was very clear that something very significant had happened to her, to cause this normally effusive and flamboyant woman to become so discomposed. "Did you have an encounter with a mountain lion by any chance?" my wife piped. "I can see something has scared you half to death." "She needs a shot of bourbon," said one of the guests. "The poor girl is shaking like a leaf." I poured a glass of orange juice for Elsa, laced with a couple of shots of bourbon, which she drank down very quickly, and before long she calmed down considerably. "Tell us what happened, Elsa," said one of the guests, a very likeable man called Scott from England. Elsa composed herself. "I'm not sure any of you are going to believe what I'm going to tell you. You're probably going to think I'm bonkers and as mad as a hatter, but I swear to you, I'm not making any of this up. But if you don't believe me, I can honestly say I will not blame you for that, because if I was wearing your shoes, I would most certainly not believe me either. Last night I had a dream about the walrus, and as you can imagine, I broke out in a cold sweat all over again, with the dreadful, all-consuming fear of getting fat overtaking me, which always gives me an obsessive desire to immediately start exercising. "Oh, please, Elsa," laughed Bill, one of the people on the cookery course. "You're as skinny as a rake. You'll never be fat a day in your life, girl." "Thanks, Bill. You're good for the morale, you really are. But sorry, I do disagree with you. Anyway, let me get to the story. I decided I was going to get up extra early to go running, as I was already awake, and the dawn had broken. I put on my running shoes as quickly as I could, and ran through the pretty meadow towards the woods. It was truly magical. I promise you there's something about getting up really early that's so uplifting and energizing, especially when you can see the glorious golden sunset rising over the valley and listen to the morning bird song. Everything is covered in a glistening, moist morning dew. It's almost too perfect. As I was running down the hiking trail in the woods, I saw what I can only describe as a startled red fox that I don't believe had even seen me. It was crossing my path, and he was ever so beautiful. But I did discern that his coat was really puffed up to double its normal size, almost as if it was terrified out of its skin by something. I've certainly seen that with my cat at home when he's scared stiff about something. So I instinctively sensed that something was clearly up, because that fox was so unsettled by something. As I ventured into the woods, I heard the most terrifying low guttural growls, and I stopped dead in my tracks. I could feel butterflies fluttering around in my stomach and cold, feverish chills running down my spine. It sounded as if two male African lions were literally engaged in an aggressive altercation, like when they fight to the very death over a pride of female lions. It was that discomposing, unnerving, and a vicious sound that I was very well acquainted with from all the wildlife documentaries I tend to watch. Of course, common sense prevailed, and I assured myself that there were no African lions here in Kentucky. I know I should have turned around immediately and run straight back to the farmhouse like any normal, sensible person would have done. And believe me, I very nearly did. The problem with me is that I'm a highly inquisitive person. I knew if I didn't check out what was happening, that all my life I would live to regret that decision and be left wondering, what the heck was that sound? So I ran very stealthily towards the sound, with a large piece of timber in my hands for self-defence, should I actually need it. I ran from one tree trunk to another, like they do in the movies when they intend to ambush someone by surprise. But in my case, I just wanted to remain in the shadows, unobserved, inconspicuous and invisible. That was when I saw them. For a moment, Elsa became incredibly quiet. I noticed that her eyes grew as round as saucers, and she physically began to shake all over again. "Saw what?" I piped. "These two massive creatures. I've absolutely no idea what they were, but I knew at once they were male, because their energy was very testosterone-driven, confrontational, aggressive, and exceedingly dominant. Both of these creatures were consumed with rage, and their anger was so tangible and robust that I kid you not, their thunderous movements literally caused the ground beneath my feet to vibrate. I knew at once that they weren't bears, but they were covered from head to toe with long hair. The smaller of the creatures was a silvery grey colour, and the other creature was completely black, raven black. The creature stood up straight on two powerful legs. I noticed they possessed very long arms and human-like hands with tuft of hair growing up to the knuckles on their fingers. I promise you, these creatures were so human-like, it was almost alarming, because every aspect of them was so like us, with the exception of the long hair that graced their bodies and the peculiar arch-shaped heads. I would say each creature was possibly equivalent to 4 men, because they were that huge. And when I say huge, I mean they were quite literally giants, with barrel chests and powerful bodies. And I guarantee you this, that they would make the strongest man in our world look puny and pathetic by contrast. And I'm not even remotely exaggerating when I say this. I've never seen 2 critters fight like this before. I mean, those bullfights you see in Spain pretty much are like cherry-picking compared to what I was witnessing. It scared the living daylights out of me because it was so brutal. Every punch was devastating, almost like a sledgehammer going right through the skin and literally bursting it open like a boil. I assure you, that was the force behind every single punch of those creatures. I could see that they were both bleeding badly, and I knew and sensed it wasn't going to end well. Truly, I wanted to scream out, "Please stop! Please stop!" But I held my tongue, for I was so afraid of how these creatures might react should they happen to see me. The creatures were roughly the same height, at possibly 8 foot tall, and 700 pounds at a guess. And as they fought, they were snorting, grunting, and breathing heavily, much like a horse breathes. The irony is that the smaller of these 2 creatures, the one with the silver-grey hair, did seem to have the upper edge. I think he was more skilled, slick, and agile as a fighter, and he pinned down his opponent and began beating his head so hard, like you would beat a punching bag at the gym. Seconds later, his opponent was dead. The next thing I knew was I heard this thunderous, raucous commotion, and then charging through the brush like an enraged rhino was a black female critter who looked far from pleased. She glided up to the deceased body, and on seeing it, she began to scream. I sensed that maybe this dead body was her partner. I watched in awe as she boldly punched the silver-grey creature with her fists. He was already bleeding from open wounds and gashes all over his body, and certainly didn't appreciate being hit by this female. He took offence at her feeble attempts to lash at him. He was far more powerful and intimidating than she was. In the end, he just lifted her in his arms, as if she was as light as a feather. She must have been about 6 foot tall, and he just threw her into the brush. He then growled very viciously, and began to beat his chest proudly, as if to say, "I'm superior, I'm the boss, so get a grip, lady." He then glided away through the woods. The female got up, raced over to the dead corpse, cradling it in her arms like it was a soft rag doll. She began to wail. It was clear she was very distressed and upset. Oh, I felt so sorry for her. I wanted to run over to her and comfort her, but I was so terribly afraid in case she lashed out at me, because she was very intimidating. I eventually watched her dragging the deceased body through the woods by the legs, and then she was gone from my sight. As you can imagine, everybody was astonished by Elsa's story, so after breakfast, in an excited frenzy, we all ventured out in the woods to investigate the site where this fight had apparently transpired. We had forgotten about our morning visit to the dairy farm, as Ella's story had invited much commentary and excitement among us. Sure enough, we saw evidence of deep indentations and flattened ground cover where a scuffle had obviously occurred, and there were blood droplets on much of the grass, and tufts of grey and black hair snagged to bramble bushes, which I gathered for a DNA profile that I intended to send off to a laboratory for testing. We continued to cautiously walk through the wood green, making sure that we were as quiet as possible. I did discern that everything was unusually still, so much so that all you could hear was our feet trailing through the brush, crunching twigs and leaf litter, but there was absolutely no bird song. I was heartily relieved and glad to be carrying my rifle, because as crazy and as incredulous as this may sound, I truly perceived we were in close proximity to an apex predator. I'm pretty certain that this is the feeling that must overcome most wild animals when they sense danger is close by, because I promise you, I'm not exaggerating when I say that I could almost taste it in my mouth like a flavour. I glanced around at the rest of our group and could tell that they were all feeling unsettled, discomposed, and very much on edge. All of a sudden we heard a wailing sound, and that was when we observed this big bear-like creature sitting close to a sizable mound, which looked like a burial plot, that was covered in sticks, positioned in such strategic ways that they looked ominously like markers with significant meanings behind them. The creature was cuddling a small little youngling in her lap that was so tiny and covered in dark hair, and they were sitting next to the grave. I was certain this was the partner of the deceased male and its youngling. All of a sudden one of the men in our group sneezed, and the creature turned around and came gliding towards us, and when she saw the 8 of us hiding behind a tree, she curled back her lips and began to scream. The sound that came out of this creature was utterly terrifying, so much so that we began to run through the woods as fast as we could towards the farmhouse, while the creature began to chase after us, and was even throwing stones at us. Everyone was terrified, and 2 of our guests were actually crying. My wife actually had little sympathy for us when we got back. "You deserve what you got," she told us. "You were spying on a grieving widow who clearly has lost her partner. How could you be so insensitive? If I'd been in her shoes, I would have done exactly the same and hurled stones at you too. You were invading her space and privacy. No one wants to feel crowded, especially when you're grieving." To cut a long story short, everyone was intrigued by what we had seen, but no one could fathom what on earth it was, and the only conclusion that we could reach was that it was a wild woman. I wish I knew why the 2 male creatures had been fighting to the death in the first place. It occurred to me that they could be different species of these creatures, which might explain the obvious discord, hostility, and hatred that they experienced towards each other. I now know, all these years later, that the creatures we saw were actually Bigfoot, and I truly regret that I never sent the hair to the laboratory for DNA testing, as now the evidence is very much degraded. My wife informed me that she took a basket of fruit and flowers to the grave in the woods for the wild woman, and the following day she received a couple of river stones on our doorstep, so it seems we made peace and amends with the Bigfoot. I realised with a great deal of infuriation that, as usual, my wife was absolutely right. We should have left her alone to grieve. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.